And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's a fantastic crowd tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces and some new ones. I am joined, as usual, but as I haven't been recently, by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
It's great to have you back, Miss Olivia.
I am thrilled to be back.
For those of you who don't know, we had a little bit of a scare when Olivia got into an accident about a month ago. And,
Not my fault.
Oh, exactly. Severely at
Yes.
fault was the driver. But you come through. How are you doing?
I'm almost mended.
Amazing. And it's just kind of like your incredible resiliency, I think, that we've seen over and over again. But
I feel very blessed.
you're already back and on top of the job in more ways than anybody
Yes.
could be.
And I want to give a shout out right now of thanks to Carly from Dimensions and Beyond
Yes.
for helping so much in my absence.
Carly did a
She's the
fantastic
best.
job. We had some help there. The backbenching from Carly at Dimensions and Beyond, fantastic.
She did an outstanding job.
And of course, Groovy Bean helped out, and Gigi Young did a fantastic job. Just amazing. But I'll tell
But now
you.
it's all about me.
How do
But
you
I
mean?
also, while we're talking about my accident, just for a second, I know that there are a lot of energy healers in the audience, and a lot of people have been praying for me. And I want to thank you so much because I am certain that it did make a difference.
There's
And
no question.
My healing is almost miraculous.
Absolutely. I got emails today saying that they were praying for you, and just, it's remarkable, actually, and it's the great things that you inspire, but we're all so happy that you're doing well. Fantastic.
I'm doing so well.
Oh, no, she even brought the blue chicken in.
Yes.
She does it. She's got a blue
That's
chicken.
being scruples.
And I'm sure we'll make use of that blue chicken eventually. Now, so we're back. We're badder than ever. Actually, I figured out, because we had run a recorded show even right before that happened, that you haven't done a show since late July. So, wow, amazing.
I'm a little rusty.
What? No, definitely not. See, you at half-mast is like 100% of anybody else. But, so we have a great show for you tonight. It's going to be really deep, and it's connected to so many episodes, but there's so many new things in here tonight. So if you're familiar with the X Series episode that we did on Howard Hughes last summer, you will know that we went through a number of things, including the strange connection to Hughes Aerospace, to secret space projects. This is a little different and goes very deep on the political side and on the Atlantis rising side. So we're in X Series episode 64, and it is Howard Hughes, really, really deep in the Hotzone. And the thing about Hughes is he's an enigmatic figure. He is someone who certainly at different periods of his life tried to do amazing, amazing things, I think, which we can all admire, and then later was heavily, heavily taken over as a person by the Central Intelligence Agency. And by the end, he became the ultimate cloned version of himself, and God knows what they did with the real one. And we're going to expose some of that tonight, but what's most important is we're going to show a very, very key connection of Howard Hughes' enterprise in the Hotzone, in the Bahamas, along the Atlantis rising theme and the political machinations that were going on and the things that he was involved with to make all that happen. So it's quite remarkable, and you have to keep in mind, as we've done these Hotzone episodes, there's going to be some crisscrossing, because Ernest Hemingway shows up here, very interestingly. JFK shows up here, very unusually. Nixon shows up here. Edgar Casey shows up. And then we have people from the UFO movement showing up, like George Van Tassel, who was a personal test pilot for Hughes. So we're getting a lot of deep, deep threads that are going to connect this whole story. And of course, we have a whole series of Hotzone episodes that go back to last fall. The thing that's going to make this one unique is it's going to tie a lot of threads and add a lot of new facts. But the more we get into the Hotzone, the more we realize it's a hotbed of geopolitical activity around this theme of land rising and ruins available from a lost culture. Those two things are, whenever we go into the deep politics of it, we could always say, Yes, we understand that there's drugs involved in the hot zone. It's very lawless in a number of ways. There's a lot of international waters. There's a lot of officials you can bribe. There's so many things. Olivia's looking at me like, oh, you've been bribing some officials? And interestingly, we see figures show up there and get booted out. Look at John McAfee recently, who went to Cuba, and he was even at Ernest Hemingway's villa there, which, as we've shown, there was a national security incident there during the Kennedy administration. So we've got a number of unusual threads and factors, but whenever people get around the hot zone, it's undeniable that a strata of our culture, of our civilization, of our society, understands this theme. So we have people like John Lennon and Yoko Ono who bought up lots in the hot zone because of the theme of Edgar Cayce saying there's land rising and these Poseidon temples are going to be part of that. The reason that's significant beyond just the incredible curiosity, I mean, this would be like King Tut's discovery on steroids, a completely lost culture of Atlantis. But beyond that, Casey makes reference to something called the two-eye stone, which is a whole different form of energy utilization, and a crystal energy utilization curve. It's in this two-eye stone. The Atlanteans had used it for spiritual contact. These are the echoes, the legends from it. And what Casey actually said is that a group showed up at a certain point and said, hey, we can use this technology to dominate the other groups. Let's do it. So we see themes like that now. But apparently they wiped themselves out, and it took culture and civilization a long time to get back, which is this weird echo of some stuff back there that was very advanced, when humans acted like gods and these types of things. So there's something central to all this, which is that the Atlanteans, whatever effect it was that they created when they were destroyed, I've used the term apotheum. And what we have as a foundation on this show is something called X Steganography. And the X Steganography is something that the mystery schools used to make reference to this without spelling it out for everyone. It was kept in these secret societies over thousands of years. What I discovered was that the X Steganography is something that they incorporated into the secrecy of government programs relating to the aerospace industry. And that was my way in. And I had kind of studied these things on two different lines. I'd been studying the secrecy around government stuff, and I personally was studying esoteric things, and I have been for years. And the mystery school activity and what their message and their legacy and what they've really vouchsafed for us now. And very interestingly to me, the X Steganography, which is using this X as something where these people could look at it and it would be in plain sight. You'd call something like the X-37B, for example, the space plane that has just finished the longest orbit in history. But to us, it's just like, oh, they're calling it X. But for them, they understand what the X represents. And it's not, experimental or unknown or whatever. It's completely different. It has to do with this X tech. And the X tech has been residing inside the UFO file. So these government agencies and the people involved and invested in them, who are very, very familiar with mystery school activities. I think sometimes we think of mystery schools as being a monastery in some mountaintop somewhere, and that's a wrong way to think about it. Certainly, they've kept the traditions alive that way, but they're very active in our everyday lives, and these people in these government agencies are familiar with them. So what we have there is this kind of spreading out idea, and what's happening is those people are using a very ancient form of a text within a text, which is what steganography means. And we're lucky that some of these things started to come out during the era of like Francis Bacon, and it was Johannes Trithemius who wrote this whole thing about what steganography was. So we've had it with us now for 300 or 400 years. But if you were looking at it and just studying that in some kind of Baroque esoteric fashion, and you weren't looking at the government aspect now and how they're using it, it would just seem like something very nice and well-to-do that they were doing. When you put those two things together, which is the foundation of this show, which is the X series, it's X Steganography. It's an X Steganography series. That's what we're studying. When you put those together, it's like the Rosetta Stone, because when Napoleon made his run and he went into Egypt in 1799, they discovered the Rosetta Stone. 20 years later, Jean-Francois Champollion, he interprets it and says, these three different things are the same announcement in three different languages, and the top one was hieroglyphics. So we were very lucky, because without the hieroglyphics code, it was the same announcement in Greek and Demotic. Without that, we would not have the key. So we just have a bunch of fancy buildings in Egypt with pictures on them and not understand anything of what was happening there. The X Steganography is certainly the same exact kind of thing, and this is the nature of what we're looking at when we get into that. So tonight, as we go through the layers of Howard Hughes, his activity in the Hotzone, the geopolitical theater that was going on, and the posturing by the Central Intelligence Agency to hold this territory for these lands that are rising, and to really investigate these ruins and get rid of these other major nations that are also involved, like China, like Russia, like Cuba. It's a major behind-the-scenes battle, and what we can show in this show is really, during the program, you start to get the idea of the nature of that battle. And at times, I've had conversations with Dr. Joseph Farrell, who has called it archaeological wars, which I like the term. That when we came up with a series of shows, we did that. That's really what it is. And they have so many programs around finding these relics that you would be amazed to be looking through the files of the Central Intelligence Agencies and others. And they have programs that are dedicated to finding, for example, is the Hall of Records really under the Sphinx, as Edgar Cayce said? That's a program that the CIA enlisted in 1964. On the record, it's not even someone's conspiracy or someone's idea, it's a fact. So this is the nature of the environment we find ourselves in. We need to step up our understanding of the mystery school knowledge when faced with the geopolitical problem. And that's part of what we're going to do tonight. It's not going to be a quaint biography of Howard Hughes. It's Howard Hughes in the Hotzone. What was he doing down there? Mm-hmm. So we're going to dig into that. Before I jump on that, Miss Olivia, how is the temperature out there?
It is great, and I have a question right away.
Excellent.
So Down Jones Muller wants to know, didn't DJ say Howard Hughes owned the theater where Oswald got arrested?
Yeah, isn't this fascinating? His holdings included the Texas Theater, which is remarkable when you think about it. Now, what's really fascinating is if you look at the Kennedy assassination and you are looking at RFK's reaction, his first thought goes two places, to the Central Intelligence Agency and Howard Hughes, which were becoming one and the same at that point through the figure of the Vice President Nixon, who had relied heavily on Hughes, and Hughes had relied heavily on him. One of the real miracles that Nixon pulled off as Vice President for Hughes is Hughes was getting taxed to death because he's one of the richest men in the world, and being the heir to this family fortune really from a young age. And of course, he did a lot more than just, hang out and be a billionaire. I mean, he directed incredible movies. He developed incredible airplanes. He was a very active person, but nonetheless, he was in this situation, especially in the 50s, where they had an incredibly hardcore tax structure. And how Nixon got him around it is they said, all this stuff that you're doing for aerospace, apply a medical aspect to it, and you can make it all nonprofit, and all the tax profits will be for a medical charity, which is still around now, actually, which is a remarkable thing. And so this Hughes medical, Hughes pharmaceutical, all these things were completely under wing of his aerospace, and they just changed the label so that he could write off the taxes. Now, it's quite remarkable because when you look at the nature of the activities he was engaged in, and we look at a group, for example, like the TTSA, who we've covered very much on this program, the To the Stars Academy, a CIA outfit meant to create this false paradigm of a UFO threat and pretend that it's disclosure. Those are all CIA guys, and we've done the programs where they have Tom DeLonge is the front man and Luis Elizondo is the ex-CIA guy who supposedly is coming out and saying, hey, I'm helping everyone. But we've uncovered a number of falsehoods basically through the work of people like John Greenwald, the Block Vault, and but it is very interesting because they're doing the same type of thing. If you notice, there's a lot of people on their board who are medically oriented. Elizondo himself has a number of medical specialties. It's quite unusual. When you get into the Central Intelligence Agency, there's always a scientific medical aspect that they have there because it's such a flexibility for them, because with a turn of a paper here or somebody's signature there, they can lock somebody into a mental institution, for example. They can take control of their estate. Let's suppose you have like a Whitney Houston or someone like that, and you want those residuals over years.
Or Britney Spears.
Britney Spears, there's no doubt. There's a whole Free Britney movement going on right now, and it is very much because there's a lot of behind-the-scenes activity on these celebrities to control their output, one, and then the finance. So we do see this over and over again, and we have to be very leery when it comes into the independent side. Now, I want to mention in regards to TTSA, it's quite remarkable because the TTSA was called up before Congress and labeled by Congress, actually shown to be engaging in something that they were saying, these are very risky stock activities, the way they've set this thing up. This is how you get stock fraud. And they use TTSA as an example in Congress. So don't think we're not going to do a show on that, and those guys are going to have a lot to answer for. But what about all of the the good humor people in the UFO field who are trying to promote the CIA group, and people who've done good work in the past, like George Knapp, but now they're arm in arm with all these CIA people coming in to do what? To control a narrative. Why? Because they're into mind control. So the way you break out of that mind control is to back off and say, well, when it comes to the UFO file, for example, we don't deal with the CIA. It's very simple. It's very simple. But it needs to be done. I guess that's the big trick with it. Now, this show's not about the TTSA, but it is important, I think, for us to get that on the record. And since we haven't caught up on a few of those in a while, we've also seen the activity of the various disclosure cult activity and some conferences that came up here in August. So we have this wave of disinformation that's going on as we speak. And it's very important that, outlets like Dark Journalist and the people who've appeared on this show who want better things or are looking into giving you the real facts, those are the things that we need to get behind. And when we get the phony flag waving for the CIA and things like that, it needs to be rejected so that they know where the boundary is. And I think that we see this over and over again. And when it comes to the story of Howard Hughes, you're going to see it all over there too, because half of the story about Howard Hughes is fiction. It just is. The official story, the one we know of, this kind of eccentric guy who just started to hang out and grew long fingernails, that is the kind of, using this kind of disability that he had against him to paint him as a freak, so that we wouldn't go deeper and find out who controlled him like a puppet and drained his resources and harvested his life activity. This is very important too, because Howard Hughes is very close to Hollywood. As a matter of fact, when I was developing this show, there was a whole sideline factor, and I said, you know what, I'll do a show on Howard Hughes in Hollywood at some point, because there's just so much activity. But tonight, it's about the Hotzone. And let's get into the Hotzone a little bit. I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X, series 64 now, and it is Howard Hughes and the Hotzone Atlantis Rising breakthrough. It's interesting to speculate, on one hand, what Hughes was doing there, and then when we combine it with the facts on the ground in the context of what we've put out about the Hotzone in this X series, it starts to make sense. It starts to come together. As a matter of fact, some of the aspects are chilling when we get right into it, and that's what we're going to do. Let's take a quick look at the hot zone
Can I ask a
itself.
question?
Yes, oh yeah.
Okay, so Chris Beatty wants to know, how much, if any, of Hughes's wealth came from the CIA? Was he the model for future CIA funding?
Interesting. It went the other way around, actually. The CIA used him as a black budget operation. So it was, you know, it was this unlimited source of supply that they could rig things in other countries so that his investments and his activities would prove far more beneficial, just like Nixon was doing for him. And then he would turn around and, he gave Nixon's brother, Donald Nixon, who's little talked about, is a very interesting figure in the background when we get right to it. But Donald Nixon took a $250,000 loan in 1956, which was during the election of Eisenhower in the 50s with Nixon as VP. And then that's right after that is when Nixon did all these favors, like turning Hughes Aerospace into a medical charity, which is quite a remarkable twist.
Okay, another question?
Yes.
Okay, the UK Today wants to know,
Uh-huh.
was Hughes involved in Area 51?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, he is in development of special aircraft. I have an article tonight that's going to show him involved in the redevelopment of the UFO file and how he was kind of removed from that side of it because he really wanted control of it. And they had their own people working on it. And so they started to see him as a loose cannon at that point. Because although Hughes was controlled in the end, certainly by the Central Intelligence Agency for decades, he originally was a little too much of a wild card. And what they did is they used his incredible patriotism against him. That's what we're going to see, and it's very unfortunate that he had to go through that. He became a victim of circumstances, and he also had some really unusual personality quirks. There's no question about it. He was an eccentric billionaire. Okay, yes. However, there's much more to the story. And I think they basically want you to think of this kind of crazy germaphobe who hid out in a hotel. It's got nothing to do with reality. It's a very small part of the story, actually. Let's take a quick look. Those are great questions already, and I'm looking forward to more. What I want you to do, actually, is because we have Olivia back, we're able to take questions.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to do a very robust Q&A in the second half of the program. What you want to do now is ask all the questions in caps, right, Olivia?
Right.
And that way she can just grab them out, and we know that she's going to put all that together for the second half of the program. Okay. And it is great to see everyone out there. We are thrilled to get to your questions. Let's take a quick look now at what we're talking about. That's the hot zone. It's a very important area of geography that we're talking about. We've got here the coast of Florida, which is about to be hit, actually, with an incredible Hurricane Dorian, which is rolling on in. It's actually in Bimini right now, as I just read before I came on air, Miss Olivia.
Interesting.
Outrageous. Over here you have Cuba, where Polina Zalitsky, this little point here, I don't know if you can see that. It is the lit up point closer over there. It is. And that is really quite remarkable because what it's doing is showing us where the ruins were found. And that's very, very important because Polina Zalitsky found a series of ruins there underwater in 2000. And this is the foundation of so much of the hot zone activity around Cuba and a lot of the intrigue there. Now, over here we have the Yucatan Peninsula, and further off in this whole area, there's Bimini. So we've got Bimini, the western tip of Cuba, the Yucatan Peninsula, part of the Gulf of Mexico, and over here to like the Bay of Pigs area. This is the hot zone. The hot zone was pointed out to me when I was doing these programs. Someone got in touch with me through interesting back channels, and I always say to the NSA, don't bother going through my emails because that's not how they contacted me. And they let me know that that area that I was discussing was part of an NDA that they had. They were a non-military person, but they were part of a oceanographic expedition to explore the surface of the bottom of the ocean. And the NDA that they had to sign was that if they saw these things as they were going by, like pyramid ruins or large structures, and I mean large city-sized structures, that they could not report them to the outside world and they could not photograph them. So the area in question was referred to as a hot zone. Now, interestingly enough, testing this out with other people and people who'd done research about it, I'd found out that the hot zone is something that a lot of people know about in these circles, that it's called by different things, but there's an area down there that if you mention it, and you're involved in either the military or an oceanographic institute or you're a government functionary, you can't mention them. So they literally have you sign it, and if you break the NDA, there's all kinds of legal implications. This is why we haven't heard more, although a number of things have come out. Now, in this hot zone is Bimini, and Bimini is a key point along with the western tip of Cuba. But why is Bimini so key? Two reasons. Bimini was pointed out by the psychic Edgar Casey in between 1926 and 1943, as 17 years where it came up in different readings, talking about how Bimini would be the site of ruins that were rising and land that was rising, and that the land that was there previously that had gone under is what all of these legends were about. That's what we call Atlantis, okay? This is where it came from. Now, Casey said in the readings that it would be actually in 1968 or 69 that we'd first start to see these ruins. And it would be off the coast of Bimini. Okay. Then in 1968, that's what they found, literally. And that's them diving over it there. You get a pretty good idea, kind of the size of this. I was talking with Graham Hancock when he was here about his own dives over it, and he said, you know, what's remarkable about it is it's only in 10 or 15 feet of water, which is incredible because that means truly that land is rising, because if you went back over time, people couldn't see those. Now, in 68, there was a diver named J. Manson Valentine, and he was going over and he saw the ruins and he reported it. So Casey's prediction and his timeline there worked like a charm. But what was he talking about? He said that that portion was called Poseidia in its time, and it was one of the third islands of Atlantis, and it was incredibly technologically advanced, and that the misuse of these two-eye stones, these large power curve crystals, caused the area to sink. And in a huge kind of destruction, it went down. Now, there's a lot of interesting activity around people who look for comets and they look for other things that did in Atlantis, and they found some great things. I'm sure it was a combination of factors, but there's no question that the Casey readings point specifically to these two-eye stones that the Atlanteans were using as a power source, and how they basically went haywire unintentionally. It's kind of like us setting off a nuclear accident that we couldn't control, which, when you look at things that just happened in Russia a couple of weeks ago, you realize we're still on the bullseye for that. That could happen at any time. And all you have to do is look back at incidents like 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl or Fukushima to realize that that's true. It's incredibly deadly technology. So what happened is that a series of these readings came up, and there was a whole set of them that disappeared, and they had to do with copies that Casey was giving these businessmen all of these different reports about Bimini and developing it as a tourist site. But what happened was this Atlantis information came through, and then the second round of activity, where they usually kept, the client would go away with a copy and then they'd keep a copy, they went back and discovered a week later that their copies were gone, meaning somebody had cleaned them out. This became very interesting because later Casey would be giving some lectures in New York City, and these same businessmen would show up after they had completely dropped off the face of the earth. And then he would see them out in the audience and figure, hey, we'll talk afterwards about those readings and all the rest of it. And then when the lecture's over, those guys are gone. They're nowhere to be found. So it is very interesting, the readings themselves. There's a mystery there. But what the readings essentially said was that in this area were going to be large-scale ruins that would connect to this Poseidia, because it was rising. It was actual land that was rising. So not only was the land rising and going to become a geopolitical football, because what do you do with land that just rises? It's totally free, it's fresh, you could start your own continent, especially if it rises in international waters. So you have to be on top of that kind of thing. But the ruins themselves and the archaeological wars theme, and if we think about the Two-Eye Stone, how powerful it was, there's a great kind of interest on behalf of these countries to get there first. And this is what we have to keep in mind in all of these stories, as deep as they get, that a lot of this activity in the Hotzone is about Atlantis rising. And if we can get that as part of the dialogue, we'll get a lot more light on the subject. There's no question about it. So Casey set us up. Let's take a look at what Casey said was there. Well, he's talking about how the Two-Eye Stone brought down Poseidia in that area of Bimini some 10,500 years ago. Actually 12,500 years ago, because it's 10,500 BC. So he says the powers from the crystals were not intentionally tuned too high and brought the second period of destructive forces to the peoples in the land and broke up the land into isles that later became the pyramids when the further destructive forces were brought in the land. So that technology somehow broke up the land originally, but it also reverberations, volcanic activity, earthquakes. This is what it set off. Through the same form of fire, the bodies of individuals were regenerated. By the burning through the application of the rays from the Two-Eye Stone, the influence that brought destructive forces to an animal organism. Hence the body rejuvenated itself often and remained in that land until the eventual destruction. Now this is a little earthquake. Something obviously went by. So what he's saying here is that this technology is so powerful and that it could actually regenerate human tissue. So somebody gets to be about, 70, 80 years old, and instead of going into an old folks home, they get regenerated and they're young again. And some people might look back at his stories of Atlantis and think, what's science fiction? This is 1926, this reading. Okay, so he's going to describe the Two-Eye Stone for us here. As to describing the manner of construction of the stone, we find it was a large cylindrical glass, as would be termed today, cut with facets in such a manner that the capstone of same made for the centralizing of the power or force that concentrated between the end of the cylinder and the capstone itself. So it's a series of power stations using this. As indicated, the records or the manners of construction of same are in 3 places in the earth. This is what we know as the Hall of Records. We know about the famous one, which is under the right paw of the Sphinx, and everybody wants to get at that one. But there's 2 others, and they're all the same. So what he says, the first one's in the sunken portions of Atlantis, or Poseidia, where a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater near what is known as Bimini. This is a crucial reading because it's the first indication. This is before he said it'll be discovered in 68. This is the first indication there's a temple there. Near what is known as Bimini off the coast of Florida, and in the temple records that were in Egypt. So he's saying there that that's the Sphinx one, and then the final one is the records that were carried to what is now Yucatan in America. Remember that Yucatan Peninsula, and one of the interesting things is that the oceanographer, Paulina Zalitsky, whose work I cite a lot on this program, she discovered a mountain range between the western tip of Cuba underwater, an ancient mountain range that went to the Yucatan Peninsula. So they were connected at some point. And if you look at that, there's a lot of geologists who would back her up on that. So this was all part of the same landmass. It starts to make sense. And then he says, curiously at the end, in Yucatan, these stones that they know so little about are now, during the last few months, being uncovered. So there were these miniature versions of the Two-Eye Stone. He calls them fire stones. They're portable, portable power stations. And apparently they're being found there around 1930 in the Yucatan. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of research around that. But that gives us some idea of why the secrecy when we get around Bimini, when we get around the ruins in Cuba. There's a massive geopolitical battle going on behind the scenes, and we have to get our hands on what it is. And we're going to do it tonight through the figure of Howard Hughes, as I opened the program with, much maligned and often misunderstood, but incredibly dynamic and really somebody who achieved a lot in his life and was manipulated terribly in the later portions of it. Now, yes, Miss Livia.
I guess the your audio is not syncing with the video. Is that normal?
Oh, well, it'll go up and down. That's kind of a live thing. But it seems to work itself out as we go. But I think so far so good.
Another question?
Yes, please.
Okay, Grandma Tippy Toes wants to know: do you think that one of the halls of records might be underwater?
Casey indicated one of the halls of records, one of the three. Remember, there are three places, but the records are all the same. So the right paw of the Sphinx, underneath it, in a temple of its own, basically. Then we have the one in Poseidia, the temple of Poseidia, off the coast of Bimini. That's a very hot potato. That's why there's so many unusual visitors to Bimini. I'm certain of it. And then the Yucatan, where I'm sure in all of that different research, they've gone very hardcore. But over time, apparently, I do not believe that anyone has access to the records yet. I think that they've all been looking very hard for them. They have access to things about them, but they do not have access to the Two-Eye Stone or the Hall of Records. But they're really trying to get it. This is very interesting, of course.
Wait, let me ask one more.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Pulp Buzz wants to know: are the Hall of Records in this dimension?
Well, just when you want Gigi Young on the program to explain how that part works, I would say part of it refers directly to this physical dimension, and part of it refers to kind of something that's accessible in the etheric zone to someone with a lot of psychic ability. And that's why Casey was able to access so much of this. No question about it. But that's a great question. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist Show. We're here deep in X Series, episode 64. It is Howard Hughes in the Hotzone, Atlantis rising. And this is the quest that so many of these people were involved with, because a series of them know that this land is rising. And the ruins part is even more powerful. But when you put those two things together, it is absolutely earth-shattering in terms of human history. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, by the way, and sign up for our newsletter. Now is the time. It's a free newsletter, actually, but you want to make sure that we have that pipeline. We have these companies throwing people out, putting them back on. They did that with InfoWars, and then throwing them out again. Kind of exercising their power there, I guess. But nonetheless, we have a much better chance of staying in touch if you are signed up through the newsletter directly. So go to darkjournalist.com right now. Make sure you do that so that you're on the list first of all. And while you're there, subscribe to the show. We've made it very affordable for you guys to get on board. And so get on board, because you're going to want to be the things that we have coming up in relation to the Hotzone and the X series in general. Trust me, you're going to want to be a subscriber. And this is the nature of the thing. You have better access, and you get to things first, which I think is quite important. Yes.
I screwed up. I do have a good question though.
Yes.
Scruples 4444 wants to know: is John McAfee our modern Howard Hughes, and who do you think he works for?
Oh boy. Well, he's definitely working for himself right now. Well, he's a rich man. He's in the technological field. When I was editor of Mac magazine, he was all the rage because his antivirus was McAfee antivirus. Everyone knew that. And he made a substantial amount of money doing that. And I'm sure he got whacked around in the 2008 crash. So I don't know. I think his status now is he's very rich, and he's looking to start a new dialogue, and he's running for president. My main interest in McAfee is what he was doing in the Hotzone, along with some of that rhetoric, because when I see people like that show up, it's kind of a wild card. Just like right now we have Richard Branson digging around, around Belize, looking at the largest sinkhole in history. When I get around that, I think of those things as fronts for some of this archaeological activity around the Atlantis rising theme. And let's look at some roots of the Atlantis Rising theme. Here is the brother of Ernest Hemingway, as we've brought forward in a few shows, just to catch us all on the same page. He's pointing to where he believes Atlantis is rising, and he's calling it New Atlantis. And what does he do? He buys lots in the Atlantic Ocean for when this land rises, because when it rises, he's going to have a whole new continent ready. And he's going to write a constitution for it and all the rest of it. So he has this incredible idealism. Meanwhile, his brother, Ernest, is hanging out in Bimini. It's kind of an interesting place, really. Well, you'd say he likes to fish. That's the traditional thing. He's a great fisher, and why not hang out in Bimini? Well, Bimini was very extremely undeveloped. If you go back and look at pictures of it, it was barely accessible in the 30s, which is when he lived there. So it's a little bit unusual. But then you dig a little deeper, as we have in this program, and you start to see the ties between Edgar Cayce and the Hemingways, including the fact that he gave a reading for Ernest Hemingway that his mother requested. So when we look at these things, we start to understand the picture a little bit better. And then when we see the connection between Casey's son spending a month with the Hemingways in Chicago, we start to get an impression. I mention this sometimes. Think about a friend that you have where you would spend a month. That's a pretty good friend. It's not a casual acquaintance. If you're spending a month with them, then they're close friends. So therefore, the Caseys and the Hemingways, there's a lot there. And the Hemingway, the number of threads that he has that show a deep, deep mystical interest, including his time in France. And we've gone into that in a few shows, so I won't go into it here. But his brother founding the New Atlantis gives us a real key idea about how important this whole thing about, the nature of what they were doing there, what he was looking for, etc. Now, the brother is flying over Cuba, and he gets a glimpse of these ruins far, far before they're put on the record and discovered by Zalitsky, some 30 years later. So there's a record of that, of him seeing these Atlantean ruins. Now, there is, that's Lester Hemingway, by the way. And when you look there at the dynasty and you see Margot Hemingway and Mariel Hemingway and the pressures that they had in their life and how their dad was a CIA agent, you start to, a lot of these things start to add up. And I think when we look at the pressures that have been brought to bear, they're very curious about why their family was put under so much pressure and why there's so much suicide and all the rest around it. A quick glimpse of the ruins that Zalitsky found. Excuse me. And here we can clearly see we've got these pyramid-type structures here, and we have these other ruins alongside of it. One of the things that Zalitsky has indicated is that she was looking at something that looked like a metropolitan area. So it's not just a few scattered ruins, it is an immense area. Now, an interesting thing happened, which is neither traditional archaeology on one side or the more independent people, because maybe out of envy or spite, didn't really get behind her and what she was doing. And she, had actually defected from Cuba to Canada. And she, through her company, she was doing this work for Castro. And he was saying that he had hired her to find Spanish galleons. Whenever you hear Spanish galleons in relation to the Hotzone on a high level, don't buy it. There's a lot of treasure hunters. But, as we've demonstrated here, when people were saying that about Gordon Cooper and the things that he was looking for from space in the Hotzone, and then they were like, oh, he's looking for Spanish galleons. No, it's always kind of this trapdoor answer. There are ruins down there, and this is what these people are focusing on, and this is what Castro apparently lined up Zalitsky for. But the traditional story is that she found the ruins, and she was able to take these surveys, and National Geographic reported it, New York Times, Washington Post, they were all on top of it. And then they came out about a year and a half later and started to sideline the story and be like, well, we don't know what it is, and so on. And finally, I had a conversation with Zalitsky where she informed me that the Cuban Navy had been the ones who had ordered her out. So there's deeper, more important conversations that we're going to have with Paulina in relation to this, but certainly that much we know for sure, which is that's what happened. And we also know, if we follow her story, that she was put in a Mexican prison. There were a series of attempts to get her not to disclose her findings for various reasons. So her case and the work that she put forward, Paulina Zalitsky, off the coast of Cuba, is quite crucial. But there are indications as to why that's so important. And it starts to open up the entire strange geopolitical situation going all the way back to the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban Missile Crisis and this incredible standoff. And now we've got weird sanctions on them again after we just opened an embassy there. Something is very, very unusual. This is not kind of traditional behavior, I would say. Another quick glimpse of the ruins and where they are. Take note of that position of where they are, because it's going to come in handy when we go to look at what Howard Hughes was doing down there. And again, just a glimpse of these kind of pyramid type structures. This is crucial because if you think about what Casey was saying, back there in 1930 in relation to it, now we're getting some idea. Oh, that is Jack Hemingway here with his two very famous daughters, and that's Margot Hemingway and Academy Award-winning actress Mariel Hemingway, who does remarkable things now out of Hollywood in relation to depression and suicide prevention and things like that, and is just really a remarkable asset to humanity. Jack, on the other hand, even as Ernest's son, Ernest didn't share a lot with him and was said to be a little bit worried about what he might be sharing with the Central Intelligence Agency in relation to their relationship and his point in Cuba. Now, I did a show that highlighted Jack back in July, so I won't get too deep into it, but we have to understand, when you get around the Hemingways and you get around the Hotzone, there are deep, deep secrets in relation to his villa that was there and the material that was there, and the national security incident that was trying to be prevented by the Kennedy, or is being contemplated by the Kennedy administration. Finally, when Hemingway committed suicide, or did he? He thought that the Central Intelligence Agency was really hot in pursuit. So those were the discussions he was having at the end of his life. But Mary Hemingway went powwow with President Kennedy, and they figured out a way to get this vault that was in the villa out of the villa. And that vault eventually became the foundation of Mary Hemingway giving it to Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis to put in the Kennedy Library. So this situation gets very, very murky there. But you can see that there's something much more extracurricular than, hey, we're looking for early stories of Ernest Hemingway or, some of his early poems or something. You're not going to risk a national security incident over that. The indications are that Ernest Hemingway, along with his brother, were part of an observation of the ruins and the activities in the Hotzone, and that this was the extracurricular activity. He'd been known to set up his own intelligence networks. So when it comes to this, with him in Bimini and then in Cuba and with the brothers starting New Atlantis, you can see how, with the revelations that we started with now last November, these things are opening up. And of course, the Kennedy Library has just these incredible displays and exhibitions of Ernest Hemingway's work based on all this. All that has to be kept in mind. Another quick thing that we revealed was about the people in this photo. That's Ernest and his wife Mary, but he's with Joseph Dreyer, and Joseph Dreyer is a very significant figure in relation to people who study the Kennedy assassination because of his close relationship to George de Mohrenschildt in the Hotzone. So that's a whole other aspect, but it is now coming forward. It's on the record. That picture exists. Nobody can say, well, maybe he was with Dreyer, maybe not. It's just on the record. And so we see those deep geopolitical ties, and a lot of people attribute them to various power plays in Latin America and in the U.S. However, it's not brought to bear that most of this, I mean, we're looking at drugs, we're looking at power, and all the rest of it. There's no question about it. But in the hot zone, the ruins are a really major political football, and that's the thing I think that we start to get our head wrapped around the deeper we go into this work. Yes, Miss Olivia.
BH says, those Hemingway gals look Pleiadian to me. What says DJ on this idea? And Leo
wouldn't be
Lyon
surprised.
says, all hot blondes are Pleiadian. What do you think?
Well, the traditional Pleiadian is Nordic looking and blonde with kind of Nordic features. And I absolutely think that's a very consistent description. And certainly the Hemingways absolutely fit that description, no doubt about it. But, that doesn't mean they're Pleiadian, but it sure is interesting. And I don't think that the Pleiadian, it's funny because, the grays get so much attention when you look at types, when you look at different types of aliens. But the Pleiadians are very pronounced. That is, there's a lot of cases involving the Pleiadians. And there was a period of time there where they were the only type we were dealing with. They looked kind of like a glamorized version of us. But yeah, I think that of the different alien stories that we hear about, the Pleiadians are certainly the most fascinating. Interesting statue here, Martin Luther King, but its location's even more interesting, which is it's on Bimini. That's because Martin Luther King spent so much time in Bimini and indeed wrote his I Have a Dream speech in Bimini and also wrote his final speech, the mountaintop speech there as well. So why is a figure like Martin Luther King spending all this time in Bimini? Well, we've got Ernest Hemingway spending all this time in Bimini. Who else is in Bimini? How about President Richard Nixon? He spends all this time in Bimini. Bimini is small. It's only 8 miles long.
It's crazy.
It's amazing.
It's a tiny island.
It is. It is barely there, but these people are deep, deep into it. And what I found as I was doing this is there's another one that we can add who spent a lot of time there. And that is Jackie O herself. Quite fascinating. The man that she's standing with is also very interesting because they bill him, Maurice Templesman, as Jackie's last love. But in fact, he had a great impact on her, and he had something which was this incredible yacht. And the yacht was connected with a charity where they went out and gave different disenfranchised natives from different cultures glasses, eyeglasses. And so he took over this unusual yacht, and guess where they started the charity? In Bimini. And so there's all these pictures of Jackie O and Maurice Templesman in Bimini. Recently, RFK Jr. put up some holiday pictures, and he's having fun there. And where is he having fun? In Bimini. So something very interesting about Bimini, either it's just this incredibly up-and-coming part of the Bahamas there, or we're looking at something totally different in terms of people's awareness. I also want to mention, in terms of somebody who was very involved with Bimini, and we're going to get into this because he was a big rival of Jacqueline Kennedy's second husband, Onassis, and that is the Greek shipping tycoon Stavros Niarchos. This is his boat, and what's it called? The Atlantis. Ah, the Atlantis. And you know what? He built an Atlantis too, and it was the greatest yacht. It had a retractable swimming pool. Wow. That was the one. So there's definitely incredibly high-level people involved with the Atlantis theme and spending time in Bimini. So let's work with that going forward. That will set us up for Hughes coming into the hot zone. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're going deep into the hot zone with Howard Hughes. You're watching X Series episode 64. Remember to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter there. It's a free newsletter. And that's going to keep you very much in touch. Before I move into this section, Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
We are doing great.
Great questions so far.
So I'm gonna just throw something out to you.
Yes.
Elemental Energetics wants to know, do you think divination could uncover questions we might not be able to explore in the physical about these ancient sites? What if we started to ask questions that an archaeologist couldn't answer? We talk about this all the time.
There's no question about it. But I like the theme, I think, that I'm picking up on from what you're saying. It's almost like dowsing. You know, they do all these incredible water dowsers. And this is an interesting thing about Casey's father, is that he could douse for water anywhere. And he had a remarkable ability to do this. And it was Casey's grandfather who had the ability to move objects and lift tables and things. This is psychokinetic ability. So it is very interesting, the idea of doing divination around in relation to the Atlantis aspect. There have been, if you look at the literature, there was a big push coming out of the discovery, because remember, the Casey work really became popular in the 60s. Casey died penniless. You have to keep in mind, you know, we have all these kind of celebrity psychics now, but Casey was a photographer who was kind of overwhelmed by his psychic activity and people coming to him in the middle of the night for health readings and stuff. So it was actually in the 60s that Jess Stern wrote a book about Casey called The Sleeping Prophet. And it was through that book that Casey's fame really spread. And what's funny is that when Jess Stern was in there at the ARE in Virginia Beach, he was looking through the records and he was reading about how different people who would bring the Casey work to the masses, and as he's going through it now, and this is 1966, he's looking down at there and he sees his name. But of course, Casey had died in 45, and so he had given the reading some 20 years before, predicting this guy was going to be doing the book. It's very, very spooky when you get around the Casey material. Let's think about that. But now let's get into Hughes, take a quick look at Hughes. Hughes is, like I said, very misunderstood in a number of ways. Very dynamic individual, perfectionistic for sure, and absolutely just off the charts in relation to the things he wanted to accomplish. His ambition, as we saw in a number of biofilms, is just off the charts, and The Aviators is certainly one of the better ones. I'm going to recommend 2 books about Howard Hughes tonight that I found to be really remarkable, because many are just not worth reading unless you like the really kind of Hollywood expose type version of things. But Hughes, his interests were, he wanted to get there first. He wanted to be unique. He wanted to be the one with the best, you know, the spruce goose, which was this plane made out of this heavy wood. It was going to be the most supercalifragilistic thing in the planet, and he had spent all this money and he was getting government contracts for it. And he had to go before Congress to account for it because it was just too crazy, too big of an idea to actually pull off. And he had a series of incidents in the 40s where, you know, they were trying to rein him in and figure out where he was coming from. And this is just before the CIA got their claws into his corporation and tried to tell him, hey, look, be a patriot and help us do all these things. But he had built an incredible company and incredible airlines, and he was quite a remarkable Hollywood film director, as well as dating a number of Hollywood starlets, of course. This comes up over and over again.
I think there isn't one he didn't date.
That's the nature.
He went through all of them.
He certainly had the reputation there. It's great. There's a picture in here. It's not supposed to be in here, but it's about the Theosophical Society in Cuba. When I was just looking around and I noticed there's some 316 lodges of theosophy in Cuba. That's a lot. That's really a lot. Quite a massive.
What's your explanation for that?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, Henry Alcott, who's one of the founders of Theosophy with Blavatsky, went to Cuba in 1908. I was able to track him down doing that. But what's interesting is Cuba has incredible you know, masonry temples. They have their own different various mystery schools. And then you have the theosophical influence. And you'd think, well, you know, in a communist island, they would have gotten rid of all that stuff and totalitarian regime. But no, if you go deep into that story, it was the Masons who protected Fidel and Raul Castro, when they were doing the revolution and they were under siege, they were hid in the Mason Temple in Cuba. So apparently that's what happened there. And we know for certain that Raul became a Mason. I don't know if Fidel was, but he was into some very, very unusual things. Another very interesting and unusual visitor to Canada, now to Cuba. This is interesting because Obama visited Cuba in 2016 at the end of his presidency, and he opened an embassy there as kind of a gesture. I mean, you know, we had just gotten through 50 years of this standoff, and he went down there, opened an embassy. We sent some people down there. They all got barraged by sonic attacks, and they had concussions, and we had to bring 80, count them, 80 of these diplomats and people back. And oddly enough, those people, when they returned, there are all these series of articles where they're like, hey, you know, people are breaking into my house now that I'm home. Like, what's going on here? So there's something very extracurricular going on, shall we say, in relation to America's relationship with Cuba. And for me, the great majority of it involves the Hotzone, and that's why so much of this stuff is going on. But here we have another president who visited Cuba, and that's Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was very concerned that Cuba fall into the right hands, but here's what's interesting. This is 1928. What else does Calvin Coolidge do? Well, he learns that there's someone who has this massive yacht off of Cuba who keeps this original edition of Alice in Wonderland. And he is absolutely fascinated to have this person come and bring the original copy of Alice in Wonderland to the White House. And then he shows up in Cuba and meets this guy and all the rest of it. And eventually that guy comes to the White House and shows him that. Interestingly enough, if you go into Thomas Townsend Brown's history, who's an incredible scientist who did so much for these agencies, and then his work all goes black, as if they took his great discoveries and just didn't want the public to share them. You know, we've described these groups before. We've got X Protect on one hand and X Share on the other. The X Protect group is involved in the real shutdown of people knowing about the X technology or the advanced technology or the UFO file for that matter, or these Atlantean ruins. So X Protect can use lethal force, and they also have unusual capabilities, like, you know, I call them kind of an astral agency because the whole Men in Black thing that comes out of X Protect, and we knew with a lot of the early scientists who were into the UFO file, like Morris Jessup, the very unusual deaths are all at the hands of this group. But X-Share is something that we don't hear enough about, but certainly Thomas Townsend Brown is in this group. These are people who wanted to share the technology and thought the culture should move forward and not sort of hide this stuff for just one small group to study. Because you know how science operates. One guy makes a discovery, another guy pings off that, gets up the ladder even further. If you have this one small secretive group doing these experiments and they have their own version of science, their own version of medicine, then the society itself is getting left behind, and we see this kind of a schizophrenic situation that's going on in relation to society now. But this really makes the point of it. But Thomas Townsend Brown reports that because he went to Cuba as part of his Navy detail, and he was recruited into this very early kind of intelligence outfit called the Caroline Group. But what he reports, very interestingly, I feel, is meeting with this person and how this person had this fascinating version of Alice in Wonderland that was in this airtight, very interesting enclosure that if the ship sank, this thing would still float. So we know that those people who understand what Alice in Wonderland is really all about and why we give it a lot of attention on this show and the deciphering of those mystery school techniques in it, that this is all very, very interesting from Coolidge to Thomas Townsend Brown. Okay, so we've brought in the figures. Now, let's get into what we're gonna go from the end and move backwards as to what happened with Hughes in the Bahamas.
Okay, if you're gonna do that.
Yes.
So I'm gonna ask Aether's question, which I know you're gonna cover. Was there any relationship between Howard Hughes, President Kennedy, and the Hemingway family? Was Mr. Hughes mirroring the Hemingways for counterintelligence?
Wow, very interesting question. I am going to answer it as part of what I'm going to read in about 5 minutes here. So just
Fantastic.
excellent question. There's no question that the Hughes became part of the anti-JFK, anti-RFK movement through the CIA influence of Robert Mayhew, who was an individual that Hughes never met, but who ran half of his empire. It's also a very interesting story that is coming out, and some of the things that we covered in the program about John Meyer, which is the show that we did on Hughes last year, contains a lot about Mayhew and how Mayhew was largely responsible for the RFK assassination. So we have to keep that in mind when it comes to Hughes. Once he's infiltrated by the Central Intelligence Agency, it's all anti-Kennedy. Yes.
Okay, everybody's voting for a question here. So Emily Lynn wants to know, Epstein's Island.
Oh yeah.
I wonder if the alleged satanic practices are magnified, more powerful by being in this area of the world.
Oh, very, very interesting. Well, there's something quite interesting that I've been working on, which is Rudolf Steiner, who started anthroposophy, and we've covered extensively on this program, is an Austrian philosopher. He talked about something called the electronic doppelganger, which is something that we deal with in our everyday lives. It's kind of like an etheric double type thing. But I happen to think that this area, because of the Bermuda Triangle, because of the Hotzone activity, because of the strange things that have been reported there, even during Columbus time, that all of their navigational tools go off and that they see bright lights and that, their compass spins and all these types of activities show us that there's something beyond just what would happen if you were, say, sailing around the Pacific. Although there are areas that are like the Devil's Triangle of the Pacific, I do feel that there's something related to the Two-Eye Stone and what the Atlanteans did in the area that creates a kind of magnetic cascading effect, which I've used the term apotheum for what they did because it's a reality distorter. So we have a group of physics that we come into this world with, and a universal law tells us that physical laws have to be observed when you're doing, say, scientific experiments. However, when you get into the apotheum effects that are described, and it's funny, the best way we can describe it now is if you get into the UFO file and you see the way that they're described, what happens? Power lines go down, people missing time. When they get abducted, they're floated through walls. So it all blows away our version of physics. So it's a different kind of reality distortion physics. I think that that's very active in this zone, and we see it over and over again with the missing planes and ships.
BH has a great comment here. Cuba
Yes.
is very close to the Tropic of Cancer, the most northerly circle of latitude the sun can be overhead. Good energetics for ritual, etc.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I remember seeing some activity where they were flying a psychic in a helicopter, but this was like 1974 and was about work that David Zink was doing, and I always thought the Zink's work is particularly good on Atlantis. I have his book here, The Stones of Atlantis, handy. But she was getting impressions from a helicopter, and like my first thought was, can we get Gigi Young up in that helicopter going over this area of Bimini? That's really where the level of research for the Hotzone should go, because I think she could pick up some remarkable things. Having worked with her, when she gets around a subject like that, she's very unstoppable.
Well, if we ever got any funding, we would make that happen.
There's no question. But let's take that a little bit further, because there's a period of time where Howard Hughes develops something called the Glomar Explorer, which is the most incredible rig ship for exploring what's beneath the ocean floor, and also can go to different depths, and it's a very revolutionary machine, much like his different planes were. Now, there's a traditional story that the Glomar Explorer, and I have a picture of it, it is quite incredible. And, it's passed hands through a number of different owners now. But this was kind of a signature achievement by Hughes. But as we learn later, the story gets ascribed, the development of the Glomar gets ascribed to the Central Intelligence Agency, and that they had him develop this now in order to get this Soviet nuclear sub that had crashed, and they wanted to raise it to the surface, and they wanted to use this thing. There's all sorts of holes in that story, but it's the traditional legend. But we can get a lot even from that legend, because this is the official story. And that's something I think is worth keeping in mind. One thing I want to mention, Miss Olivia, is that the power level on this is going down. So maybe that plug is out for some reason. You might want to check it. Thank you very much. I'll remind everyone you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's fantastic to have everyone here with us tonight. Yes, it's back.
There we go.
It's back. Nicely done.
It was not plugged in.
Bravo, Miss Olivia.
Okay.
See, what would we do without Olivia? Things wouldn't be plugged in. So the Glomar is quite important. So I'm going to read a little bit of the official story about it, and I'm going to tell you what really happened. Howard Hughes' Glomar Explorer, as the ship was named at the time, was built between 71 and 72 at the direction of Howard Hughes for use by his company Global Marine Development. Now that's where the Glomar comes from. It first began operation on June 20th, 74. Hughes told the media that the ship's purpose was to extract manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The marine geology cover story became surprisingly influential, causing many others to examine the idea. But in sworn testimony in the United States District Court proceedings and in appearances before government agencies, global marine executives and others associated with Hughes' Glomar Explorer project maintained unanimously that the ship could not be used for any economically viable ocean mineral operation. So they have a cover story on the cover story. It's quite unique. That ship, I will tell you the end before we get there, that ship was designed to observe the ruins on the ocean floor relating to the Bimini Temple. Now, so they put this cover story over it, which is Project Azorian from the CIA, and it is interesting nonetheless. The CIA contacted Hughes, who agreed to assist, that a vessel would be detected easily by Soviet vessels, which would then interfere with the operation. So an elaborate cover story was developed, yada yada, and they put the whole operation in Hawaii. However, the Glomar was in the Hotzone, hanging out in the Gulf of Mexico. So already right off the bat, they have problems with this story. The operation became public during February 75. Los Angeles Times published a story about Project Jennifer, followed by news stories with additional details in other publications, including the New York Times. The CIA, wanting neither to confirm nor deny the story, issued the Glomar response. That is where we hear that now, when they say, I can neither confirm nor deny that. That comes from this case that had never been on record before. So they go to great lengths to be like, oh, you caught us. We were trying to raise this sub, and shoot, we're just the CIA. We screwed it up. You guys ruined it. We can't do it anymore. No, that's not how the CIA works. This worked just fine, actually, and they got their cover story going for it. But they used this incredible vessel to track those ruins. Now, there's a whole series of things that happen to this ship that are very unusual as well. And what I will say is that in 2018 dollars, the project was developed was $1.5 billion for one ship. So it was quite a heavy duty project, and they had put it out there for a reason. Now, the Glomar Explorer is very important because what happens shortly before that is Hughes goes and leases an island called Quesal, which is there in the Bahamas, and a lot of very unusual things happen in relation to this, including the fact that while he is there, he may have escaped his handlers temporarily. He may have been already dead. There's a lot of different ways to look at this. But an interesting very enterprising person named Clifford Irving comes out with an autobiography of Howard Hughes. This book becomes a bestseller. It is completely off the charts. And when he died, now I'm going to read this from the New York Times. And again, there's a lot of spin in this. Clifford Irving, whose autobiography of Howard Hughes nearly fooled the nation, dies at 87. The greatest literary hoax of the 20th century, call it a prank, scandal, adventure, criminal conspiracy, or an early piece of fake news. Now, this is very, very interesting because, some people will remember like the Hitler diaries or these different things that have come out that have been hoaxes. But there's an incredible amount of information in the autobiography by Irving. There's a key piece of it that relates directly to what we're doing here in the Hot Zone. But I'm going to read a little bit from the Washington Post eulogy. Clifford Irving. Now, he died, in 2017. The greatest literary hoax of the 20th century, blah, blah. Okay, it features disguises, an arcane code name, Project Octavio, the world's most reclusive billionaire, and almost by chance a president. By some accounts, it may have triggered the Watergate break-in that brought down Richard Nixon. This is a very crucial point. And I have the actual Village Voice article where they explain Watergate, the Bahamas, and Howard Hughes. This is also very crucial to what's happening. But let's get a little bit of this Irving character. Very interesting guy. The hoax's perpetrator, globe-trotting novelist and Howard Hughes biographer Clifford Irving, died December 19th at a hospice near his home in Sarasota, Florida. Though known mainly by a small community of writers and artists, Mr. Irving had lived nearly a swashbuckling life as Hughes when he contacted the publisher McGraw-Hill in early '71, declaring that he obtained permission by Howard Hughes to write a tell-all biography of the aviator and movie mogul. This is very interesting. The publisher trusted him because he was in a unique position to have access to all these people, and he was able to back it up with tapes and all the rest of it. So quite elaborate for the hoax part. Let's go a little bit further. Maybe it wasn't so much a hoax, but he let too much out. He would wind up going to prison for this, by the way, for over a year. The son of a prominent New York cartoonist, Mr. Irving had worked as a New York Times copy boy, machinist, and door-to-door cleaning supplies salesman before sailing around the world living on a houseboat in India. Okay, so we get kind of a flair for all this. And they're like, one of the things that they say is that a movie came out by Orson Welles called F for Fake, where he talks all about these great fakes. And they're like, that must have been why he did it. Okay, no, I don't think so. But so what happened was that Irving said he went to meet Hughes, who was living in near total isolation inside a hotel in the Bahamas. Now, the name of this hotel is Xanadu. And this became the final chapter of the final couple of years for Hughes there, living there. The billionaire, he said, replied with a thank you note praising Irving's sympathetic treatment of the subject, which Mr. Irving took as an opening to suggest a biography on Hughes himself. And there was this whole thing about how they had a lot of things in common. Okay. Mr. Irving assumed that Hughes had become so reclusive and private that he would stay silent rather than come forward and deny the book was real. He soon received a staggering $750,000 advance from McGraw-Hill and a sizable check from Life magazine, which planned to publish excerpts from what became known as the Autobiography of Howard Hughes. Now, he traveled to Mexico, Puerto Rico, and the Bahamas to meet with Hughes in parked cars, motel rooms. Much of the time, he was with his mistress, Danish singer and actress Nina Van Pallant. Okay, so they do this whole kind of shebang, and he comes out with this book. Now, this is what's interesting. The guy had such incredible detail and facts about Hughes that eventually they have this whole story where, like, he did this incredible autobiography of Hughes, but it was all a hoax, and he got sent to prison, and all these other things happened to him. But if you think about it, as a result of him putting out this autobiography, the phony Hughes had to come out and denounce it. Now, there's a number of people who feel that Hughes was already dead by the time this came out, or he had been muzzled, and they had this other fake. Now, this press conference came out and became this LP album at the time, which became incredibly popular, of Hughes denying that this autobiography was
so
real.
Weird.
It is.
What a great cover.
Absolutely, right in with the times. So it's the Howard Hughes press conference, and he gets on there and he's like, "That boy there's lying. He's lying. That ain't me." But nonetheless,
It's just a recording?
it's just
So it
him.
could be
It's a
anybody.
phone call.
Oh, weird.
And they did not present the real Howard Hughes, and he didn't come in and say, "This is really me, that's BS, and whoever did that autobiography isn't me." They have this weird, he's like, "I'm down here, down from Texas, you can't tell me what's real, that guy's a faker." Yeah, it's the worst, schlockiest thing I've ever heard in my life, and when you listen to
Is
it.
it on YouTube?
And
Can
yeah,
people- okay.
you can actually, you can. Yeah, there's no question about it. I almost recorded it for this show. Now, what's fascinating is Hughes, Hughes in quotes, says to these people that this is all bunk and whatever, and you have like, you know, the Walter Cronkite type guys being like, "Yes, yes, isn't this terrible?" And not saying that they need to confirm that this is actually Howard Hughes, just some weird caller with the CIA voice box, basically. Like, sound as much like Hughes as you can. So nobody saw Hughes. Nobody knew. The call-in is just as fake as what they want to say the biography is. Now, what was it that bothered them about the biography so much? Why did this guy have to go to prison? Okay, and you might even say, like, well, he went to prison and, like, you know, he knew it was a hoax, and he even said it was a hoax and all the rest. I have a totally different spin on what happened there, but I'm going to tell you why I think they did it. There's a section in there from Howard Hughes' autobiography, and what's it called? Meetings with Ernest Hemingway. Now, in real life, Hughes was never supposed to have met Hemingway, but in this autobiography, he does. And they do all these things in the Hotzone, very unusually. And the pseudonym that Hughes is using is Tom Garden. Now, I'll tell you something, that this name is very, very unusual for a lot of reasons. But what I kind of want, I want to crowdsource this one a little bit. I want people to take the name Tom Garden and develop anagrams, interpretations, or ideas around this. And I'll tell you what I found in relation to it, and in relation to a very famous UFO sighting. It's a weird name, Tom Garden. It's not a very normal name. Okay.
It has a weird feeling to it, intuitively.
No
right?
question.
Mhm.
There's no question that they're using a kind of code with Tom Garden, including the fact that the vault, I'll tell you what I came up with, which was that the vault that Hemingway had in Cuba, it was in the den. And guard, Tom being the guard, he's there to guard the den.
Oh,
This is what I came up with originally, and
not bad.
well, it goes even deeper. But I actually want to take this name Tom Garden, and I want people to, there's incredibly bright people who are in the ideas room in the chat. I think there's some of the smartest people who watch the X series in that chat. And
Thomas Tyson.
yes, what does he say?
I'm
Oh,
going
he
back
just
again.
comes to mind.
He's a wordsmith, right?
True,
Mhm.
true. Yeah, well, you have a lot of smart guys out there.
Mhm.
And ladies, and I would hope that this could be something that could be looked at collectively on this. But watch how this goes. This is from the autobiography, which, again, the fake Howard Hughes said was fake. Quote, Howard flies to Sun Valley under a pseudonym, swims naked in the Caribbean, is invited to buy Cuba, and contemplates ending his life, and meets with Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway and I, this is supposedly Hughes talking directly now. Ernest Hemingway and I met briefly in Hollywood when I was making movies. It was hardly more than an introduction at a party in some bungalow in that crazy place he was living, the Garden of Allah. Okay, there's garden, there's the first hint. But Hemingway impressed me, and I thought I would like to see him again. I felt the tremendous force of his personality more even than the power of his work, although I had read and admired his novels. especially the sun also rises. The occasion arose just after the war, and he goes into this early meeting. But I want to get to the real, like, the meeting in Cuba, which happens later. So what he does is he finds out where he lives in Cuba, and he goes up to his door and just knocks on it. There, Ernest came out of the door looking like a middle-aged tramp, wearing beat-up corduroy trousers and a lumberjack shirt, open nearly to the waist. I introduced myself, and Ernest said, "Come in and have a drink, Tom." Tom Garden. I came in and excused myself from the drink because I don't drink, and we talked for a while. He immediately showed an interest in who I was and why I was there. Understand, I passed. Now, here's what's weird. This guy is saying that Ernest Hemingway, as Hughes, doesn't know him, which is pretty interesting. I mean, Hughes was pretty reclusive, but this seems quite remarkable. The extraordinary thing is that I'd been in his house no more than 15 minutes, and I was sitting in an armchair and talking as freely and easily as I'd talked with any man in my whole life. Writers often give you this feeling. It may be genuine, it may be phony, you tell me, but they give you the feeling they're interested in you and what makes you tick. But Ernest had that quality in making you feel immediately home. We spent a very pleasant couple of hours. We talked about practical things mostly, more than about us, either of us personally. We talked about them in a very straightforward way that I wasn't used to, except with pilots. The thing is, at the time, I didn't want anything from Ernest, and he didn't want anything from me. I had read a couple of his books, but I hadn't dropped in to see him as a writer. It was more that I had gone in mind a certain image of Ernest Hemingway as a person who had gone through adventures and rough experiences. We spent a couple of days talking, and I invited him to take a spin with me in my B-25 the next day, which he was delighted to do. The fact that I had my own bomber tickled him pink. I told him I was doing a geographical survey on this flight. The purpose was to get an overall picture for myself of the valley and its potential. Okay, so he goes on there. So now here is somebody, Howard Hughes, flying over the Hotzone, ostensibly. He was amazed. Not only that, he couldn't get over the fact that I could fly and look around and maneuver at the same time, maintaining a running conversation with him about anything in the world. And Ernest loved all this speak. On the way back, he turned to me. There was a touch of awe in his voice, and he said, "Tom, you're a hot pilot." "You better believe it," I said. I wasn't shy about my flying skills. I left soon after that. We saw one another briefly the following day, and then I was off. But it was a rich encounter. Ernest wanted to write to me about something, as a matter of fact, but I knew he wouldn't answer. And I didn't want to create that sort of situation. I didn't see him again for nearly 9 years. It was 1959. He was so embroiled in affairs, I had no chance, sort of like a drowning man. I'd draw my head up out of the water, and I could see Ernest along the shore from time to time, but I was sucked down again and again before I could even call out to him. And he was off in his own affairs in Key West and Cuba. Cuba, as a matter of fact, is where I saw him the second time. So, now the author has this question. When you met him the first time, how did you get along with him politically and so on? And so they go and they start talking about different political figures, like Franklin Roosevelt, for example. So I'm going to move along here and get into this area where he says, in 1954, I was in Florida, where I had planned to build my own jet aircraft factory. I was already thinking of a short takeoff and landing jet. I was looking ahead to the future and intended to sell the first 25 planes to TWA, that is, to myself. And on the spur of the moment, that time in Palm Beach, I knew Ernest was in Cuba. I hopped over from Miami to Havana on a commercial flight. And then he said, so he goes up and he meets him, and Ernest didn't even ask his name. He was sitting around the pool with a few other people. I was still wearing a business suit. I had taken my tie off, stuffed in my pocket. Okay. So they start to talk, and they're getting into things, and what happens is they have this kind of warm reminiscing, and the guy asks them the question, "Did you keep masquerading as Tom Garden?" He said, "I was afraid to tell him my real name. It was such a good relationship. I didn't want to run that risk. We sat around the house and just talked. Ernest wanted to know what I'd been doing all these years. and I made up a few stories that paralleled my life. The events may have been different, but the general content was the same, so that I was lying to him in a meaningful way. The next day I was out there again with him, and on the third day we went fishing. I had taken Ernest up in my plane, and now he wanted to take me on a boat to show me his specialty. I was not a sportsman, I played golf, and so on and so forth. So what's fascinating is that he goes deep into it, and then he reveals that he's Howard Hughes, and Ernest Hemingway has this kind of meltdown about it all. And there they are crisscrossing Cuba in this plane, and checking out Ernest's specialty, which everyone would assume is fishing, but not necessarily. Now, what I think is quite fascinating is what happens to the real Howard Hughes is that he winds up leasing Quesal. And Quesal is right across from, it's in this Bimini District. It's controlled by the same government forces. And he's sitting there at a certain point when he's developing this Glomar project. He's there in the Hotzone with the knowledge from Hemingway in relation to these ruins. And now he's there with the world's best rig for scaling the ocean floor. So the combination of these factors are interesting, but I was looking for something that would give us this hint of where Hughes was coming from in all this. And I did run across it. So let's get into that now. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Fantastic.
Unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, the whole thing about Irving, the autobiography and all the rest of it, and the strange circumstances around Hughes and how his estate was controlled and how the intelligence agencies were that tight with his entire business. So, we're looking at somebody who was deep, deep into the political end of it. The reason that we have Hughes and Nixon and the Bahamas and Watergate is that it was during the election of 1960 that Nixon had asked, along with the CIA, if something could be done about Castro and if Hughes could develop a program to eliminate Castro, along with these CIA agents. So this was the material that it was feared, because Larry O'Brien had been associated and was in the DNC for Watergate, it was feared that this material linking Nixon to the JFK, these assassination squads, would become a hot potato, and was part of how Watergate happened. It's all very well outlined in this article, actually, but we can see that whenever we get around these characters, that is Nixon, Hughes, along the Cuban aspect, along Hemingway, there's a larger piece, there's a larger secret that they're working with, and there's always these deep events. There's the Kennedy assassination, there's Watergate, there's the vault, that's hanging out in his den. So yeah, what do you got?
Okay, so Thomas Tyson said that Liberty Thunder has won the anagram contest, and it is Tom Garden, Magnet Rod.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Mm-hmm. That's so good. I'm going to work with that. That is outstanding. Nicely done. Well, we had a good inspiration that somebody out there could really work with us. I like that quite a bit, and I think that that's really workable. Excellent. Everyone, I want to remind you that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here deep with Howard Hughes in X Series 64, episode 64. This is Howard Hughes in the Hotzone, and this is part of the Atlantis rising narrative. The fundamental idea is that this land rising constitutes two major things geopolitically. One, it's land that can rise and be a sovereign nation on its own. It can have huge implications, especially if it's part of a pattern. That's one. Two, and so a number of governments are interested in that. The Casey aspect, which is associated with the reason Hemingway was there and the reason that there's all this intrigue around it, is that it relates to the Poseidon temples. And the fact that Casey had said in 43, look for this in 68, you'll start to see it rise, and they found the Bimini Road, the Bimini Wall there. That, I think, is a great indication that they're looking for a lot more. But Casey had that information, and the Hemingways had access to it, and that's why I think we see the Hemingways there, and that's why we see Les Hemingway, who is Ernest's brother, actually buying ocean lots and calling them New Atlantis, thinking this is going to rise. Remember, I pointed out in this program, John Lennon and a series of celebrities have shown interest and bought lots in the Atlantic Ocean relating to this. Now, we're finding out, someone had mentioned Epstein earlier, and this is very important because Ghislaine Maxwell was involved with this ocean project, and it was ostensibly under this cover of an environmental project. We're going to go... But interestingly enough, there you are in the Hotzone trying to buy out different parts of ocean for preservation. So obviously a lot of this story is going to roll, and I mean roll out. So, you know, the Maxwell part is not so much for tonight, but keep that in mind as we're moving along here. So like I said, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter now. That is going to keep us in touch. And basically what's going to happen is you'll get a newsletter about once a week, and it'll let you know what shows are coming up, and also what events we have coming up, because we have several events coming up for later this year. So keep that in mind, and make sure that you're locked in there, because very honestly, the social media aspect, as we know, is very touch and go, and there have been some disturbing comments being passed around in those inner circles in DC that they're really going to get, you know, the conspiracy theorists, and they're really going to get the people that are speaking out. There's been this whole kind of trope of the Q stuff and all the rest of it, giving them all the bait that they need to come in and say, like, we have to clean that up and get rid of those independent journalists, when this is something that they most likely started on their own. So we have to keep that in mind as we move forward here. So the best thing to do is let's have that pipeline with each other, and make sure that you get that newsletter going. So go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. The link is easy. That's a free newsletter. While you're there, go ahead and sign up for the show and give us that ability to continue doing the remarkable work with remarkable researchers that we endeavor to pull forward here. Thank you very much. Tonight we've got Miss Olivia back and better than ever, doing an incredible job. And very shortly we're going to turn to your questions, which Olivia's been gathering, but ask them all in caps. And we're gonna take the kind of last hour of the show and do that. Okay. So, I think that the Tom Garden magnet rod thing is very interesting. Tom Garden is something which, for me, the Hughes autobiography, and this whole thing was about. There's something about inserting Hughes with Hemingway and Tom Garden that is very crucial, and this was the piece. Now, it could have been one intelligence activity versus another intelligence activity, or it could have been them trying to force this secret out of the shadows. That's what it feels like to me, and the kind of pressure around it, and the fact that people even went to jail over it. It's very, very, very interesting. So I'm going to roll into this next section, Miss Olivia, but if you got something, I'll take it.
Prognosis wanted to know, was there any connection between Howard Hughes and Robert Bigelow?
Well, that's very interesting. It would be a little early for Bigelow, who didn't really come on the scene, but, you know, he's a very Hughes-like figure. There's no question about it. And he sort of is trying to do the resort thing the same way that Hughes was. But this, you know, his thing is inflatable hotels in space. Well, I've got a great space tourism X Steganography, which we put up on our Twitter feed, which if you're on Twitter, that's twitter.com/darkjournalist. And I put it up on Facebook too, which is facebook.com/darkjournalist. And it is the Werner von Braun space station. And let me tell you, the first thing you see is that thing is covered in X Steganography. So they know what they're doing, and they know what they're talking about. I do feel that that was just one of those kind of, when we looked at it, it was almost like it was tailor-made. Okay, let's look at a few interesting figures around Hughes and this story, real briefly. Some of them will be familiar to you. This man is named George Van Tassel. Van Tassel's a very interesting guy, told a bizarre story. The bizarre story is that he basically was getting what were initially, he worked for Lockheed Martin, and he also was a test pilot for Howard Hughes. And he developed an airstrip out there in California by Giant Rock, where they did the first contact in the desert around there. They were riding off that theme because he developed something that he said he got from an alien intelligence called the Integratron, which was supposed to rejuvenate people with sound when they went in there. That's what he's standing in front of, and which he didn't get to finish in his lifetime. According to him, it was partially completed, but it does have some remarkable building capabilities. He worked on it, and he claimed that at a certain point, he really was deep into the space aspect, and he claimed to be a contactee and that they had taken him in ships and shown him this advanced technology. So Van Tassel was a tough one to dismiss. There were other guys that were easier in the 50s and 60s to say, well, it's not so legitimate, it's just something that they fantasized. But Van Tassel, I think, was one of the better, more well-spoken. He had a legitimate business, he had this incredible history, but more interestingly, he had spent all this time as Howard Hughes' test pilot and had many stories of Hughes visiting him there at Giant Rock. That's him developing it, and that shot, it's a scale model, and that's what it became later, which is this quite remarkable design that he put forward. Now, Van Tassel, there are a number of things that came up in relation to him and, exactly what he was involved with. But his fundamental thrust is that there were these advanced cultures, Lemuria and Atlantis, and that they had developed this advanced technology, and that there was two Adamic races, and that the advanced Adamic race was in a battle with this other race. So it was all this kind of stuff, very well known to people who deal, for example, with the mystery school activity, specifically theosophy. And interestingly enough, it was Van Tassel who led meditation groups and things like that in the 50s, as did George Adamski, who was another one of these Venusian, contactee guys. And he had an incredible kind of New Age background to him. But, he said, well, speaking of Pleiadians, the people that he meets in the desert, they look like angels, basically. But Adamski didn't know and work for Hughes. This guy did. Now, Van Tassel working for Hughes, we have to assume a couple of things. If he's having these kind of alien type contacts, then Hughes is aware of the stuff. One. Two, we also have these stories about Van Tassel talking about Lemuria and Atlantis. So we think about Hughes, and we think about the activity of him being there in the Hotzone, and then we think of his test pilot. It starts to give us the impression that if he took any of this stuff seriously, it could very well have been Van Tassel that gave him the heads up. There's all this information about Atlantis, there's all this other stuff. So we have a direct link there, knowledge-wise, that his test pilot was very familiar and well-versed in the Atlantis mythologies and Lemuria, had written about them, and claimed to be this incredible contactee. Also, what's unusual about Van Tassel is, beyond just his story, is the development of the Integratron, which I think anyone who's into science would have to, fess up to the fact that it's pretty advanced little structure that he put together there. And according to him, it was all about health and aging, that when you were in there, your aging patterns would change dramatically.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, yes,
Okay,
please.
so Carolyn Howdy says, FYI, Van Tassel was found dead in a hotel room a day before he was to turn on the Integratron, and the FBI showed up and dismantled the Tesla coil inside the Integratron.
It's true that the FBI confiscated his stuff. I didn't know it was the day before. I haven't seen that, but it is true that when he died, they came in and raided it, which is pretty interesting. They took him very seriously. There are reams and reams of FBI files on Van Tassel, and I think that he was one of the more well-spoken of the contactee people. But for our purposes here, he was the pilot, the test pilot for Howard Hughes. All right. Now, there's an article from Nick Redfern from 2014 about Howard Hughes and the UFO file. Now, there's just one piece of it that I think is really kind of pertinent. There are a number of intriguing issues. This is from the article. It's in Mysterious Universe. There are a number of intriguing issues that link Hughes to the UFO subject. The earliest and certainly the strangest story suggesting a Hughes flying saucer connection can be found in the FBI's now declassified files on UFOs, all of which are online at the Bureau's website, called The Vault. You think they're trying to imitate the Vault? Okay, it's July 31st, 1950 is the file, and it reads as follows. Since we're on the brink of a third world conflict, the world is more air conscious than ever. Aviation in some phases is yet in its pioneering days. Much talk goes on about flying saucers, or discs. Yeah, like you didn't know what it is. The saucer we speak about is not a military secret and is not yet owned by the government. The flying saucer, which was seen over South Chicago last April, is a large fuel tank with crystal glass wings. The file continues. It has two large jet engines on both sides. It is radio controlled. It resembles a saucer very much when in flight. The wings cannot be seen on a clear day. This is so difficult target for anti-aircraft gunners. The letter then reveals something very illuminating. The ship was financed by Howard Hughes, millionaire aviation enthusiast. It is now being tested by Glenn Martin Aircraft Company, makers of the Martin Marauder. The craft is only made for one-way trips. It has a range of 4,000 miles, a ceiling of 25,000 feet, and a speed of 750 miles per hour. Quite remarkable for that era. The file also notes, the Bureau's informant notes, so far only a few of these craft have been made, and they're usually pitched in the lake or ocean as they cannot be landed. They're merely to carry a bomb of high destruction to an enemy country. They have no wheels, but small steel rails on the bottom from which they take off. All other mechanics can be explained in detail. In closing, the FBI's source explained that the man who wielded the ship says it is by far the best long-range bombing instrument he's ever seen. The name of the ship is Dance Macabre. Now, D-A-N-S-E. That is the notable saga of Howard Hughes' associations and friendship with one of the most well-known of all the contactees in the 1950s, George Van Tassel. Prior to becoming a major player in ufology, Van Tassel spent time in the 40s working for Hughes Aircraft. He did far more than that. While employed by Hughes Aircraft, Van Tassel acted as an assistance capacity to none other than Howard Hughes himself. So, you see there's so many things we can crisscross here. There is Hughes developing what look like saucer kind of ships, and it's in an FBI file. We've got Van Tassel talking about being aboard a UFO, and the leader of the UFO, Sulganda, who's this kind of Pleiadian-looking guy, telling him, well, you need to stop using nuclear weapons, and there are all these things that you need to do there on Earth in order to get the situation under control. So we have a lot of information, and then we have the background, if you look at Van Tassel, with Lemuria and Atlantis. So it's inevitable. We're coming in close with the UFO issue, the UFO file, the lost civilization aspect, the Hotzone, and Howard Hughes. It's inevitable. It's all there and it's on the record. Now, the question is, how far did it all get? there's one other piece that I want to say is that in relation to this, which I think is interesting, which is that Hughes was, according to witnesses, called in for UFO crashes. And one of the guys who made a point about how we studied the UFO and re-engineered it is Dr. Robert Sarbarker. Now, Sarbarker is very important, and we've done a series of shows that relate to Sarbarker and the work that he did, but now he's become a non-person. So he was the most famous physicist of his era, and he was right up there in that league with some of the greatest. And if you look at some of the profiles in like Saturday Evening Post and New York Times about him, he's respected on this level that almost none of these guys are. Very involved with the deepest projects. He came forward in the 80s and said, yeah, we redeveloped the UFO. And we had all these people who worked on it, and Vannevar Bush was the one who was in charge of it. And then he passed it on to John von Neumann. And there's a couple of other people that he mentions in relation to it. And it's quite remarkable. But he said it so casually, he's like, I don't even understand why they've kept this under wraps. It actually shocks me because, it's been so long. I thought they would have released this by now. So then it gets confirmed, and there's a whole dialogue. And he follows up with another letter and a call, and they have a whole transcript from the call. And shortly, now, a year and a half later, he dies after he puts his hand on a strange substance, which is actually on his doorknob. Now, we don't know what they did with him there, but obviously he was a loose cannon. Sarbarker had worked, interestingly enough, with Thomas Townsend Brown, who we mentioned earlier, and who at the beginning of the year we did a complete show on. Now, Thomas Townsend Brown, when he was taking these vacations from his family and saying, I have to go work, I have to do all this stuff, he kept telling them, I'm going to San Antonio. Well, what's interesting is the family members would find out after his death that the San Antonio he was going to was not in Texas. It was San Antonio, Cuba. And San Antonio, Cuba is the western tip of Cuba, which is right where Paulina Zalitsky found the ruins, dead bang underneath. So we're getting a picture here of a series of people, let's call them on the X-share side, who are trying to get this material out and thwarted over and over again by the X-protect aspects. And then some people kind of in the middle, like Howard Hughes, who's being talked to by X-protect saying, you're doing a great patriotic thing by going in there and trying to find these ruins. Can you make this incredible ship for us like this one, the Glomar, so that this thing was so big, by the way, it couldn't even get through the Panama Canal. So it's massive. And its abilities, it had a long claw arm to go and scan the ocean floor. This is the activity that they were engaged in. They've got cover stories galore for it. But when Hughes was in the hot zone, he was an incredibly vital player. And his entire, practically the richest man in the world at the time, all of his resources at the fingertips of the Central Intelligence Agency, completely off the books. So with that, Miss Olivia, I am going to turn it over to you. I'm going to keep integrating, but yes.
Okay.
I want to remind everyone you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to take your questions now as we get into this this end of the spectrum, but let's keep them Hot Zone and Howard Hughes in the Hot Zone and Casey and the Mystery Skulls related for this episode. Yes.
Okay, first question. So BH asks, I believe the Integratron was an all-wooden structure, just as Steiner's. Your thoughts?
It is interesting. It is interesting. This is one of the reasons they were able to burn down the Goetheanum. The one that they put back up wasn't made that way. But its extensive use of wood, I would guess that most of it is wood, actually. There may be a resonance thing with the Integratron. They are starting to understand it more from the sound side, but he said it was never fully completed or activated when he died there in 78. He'd been working on it for some 15 years. But he said the key to it was the Tesla technology. It was the closest thing that we could understand here. And according to him, with his unusual contactee stuff, this is Van Tassel we're talking about, he was saying that it was relating to regenerating cells. So it was like an anti-aging thing. It's funny because the quote that I started the show with, which Edgar Casey's quote about regenerating the cells, and what the Atlanteans were doing with the Two-Eye Stone is remarkably similar, if you think about it. Yes.
Well, and then you've got the Les Hemingway Fountain of Youth thing.
Yes,
so
right.
There you go.
Well, this is very interesting. I'll mention that. Les Hemingway, when he goes to Bimini, he is searching for this well, which is a healing well, and he finds this healing spring, and he bathes in it, and all these people are going there to cure their arthritis and other conditions. So it's actually quite remarkable. And for him, what he says is that there are all these inscriptions and things around the well. Now there's a healing well in the Casey readings, exactly along these lines. I am quite certain that's the link there. We've shown the Hemingway-Casey link, but there's more of it. The only other thing I want to mention about that, which I think is interesting, is Ponce de Leon and these other legends coming forward. I have this short section of Egerton Sykes, which I'm going to read real quickly here, because it's all about this healing capacity that's attributed to Bimini, which Sykes, who was a researcher and a British intelligence agent, and he left behind all this incredible work relating to Bimini. He said it was called Murius in the Druidic texts and in the Celtic texts. So in this book, Ireland's Mysterious Lands, the question is asked, why did Sykes think that Murius was located at Bimini? Sykes thought that the Irish legends of the sacred cauldron of the Dagda, which came from Murius, and American Indian as well as conquistador tales about the Fountain of Youth at Bimini were derived from the same source. Sykes did not mention Arthur Brown's Origin of the Grail legend, but that book also described an Irish epic, Cathmage Turid, which may date to the 9th century AD. In that poem, the Tuatha De Danann, who we've done 2 programs on here, had a magic well which would bring the dead back to life and healed the mortally wounded. Druid physicians attended the well and chanted healing spells. This was located in the land of 4 cities. Sykes suggested the ancient civilization extended from Bimini to the Miami, Florida area. He's saying this is where they went for this, and that healing well has the echoes from mythology. So quite fascinating. I'm glad that you mentioned the well, because this is something that there's videotape from an actual visit by Les Hemingway with his daughter Hilary, who eventually became an author of Alien Abduction Tales. And and she is Mariel's cousin. Mm-hmm. So yes, the Hemingway family, very, very deep in this mystery. No question about it. Okay, I'm up for your questions.
Okay. So
the floor is yours.
There are a bunch of.
We're at the center here, the core.
Know or work with this person, that person. So,
okay.
Okay. Mr. Rob wants to know: did Hughes collaborate with Jack Parsons?
Isn't that interesting? I don't. Of course, Hughes aircraft may have been one place that Parsons went to, but I don't think that there's anything on the record with those two. I haven't run across that. Jack Parsons is he's a very interesting matter, all the way from being involved with Crowley and being involved with the foundations of Scientology and all the occult aspects, but he's an incredible engineer as well. And what they have JPL, it's actually the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but they say they named it JPL because it's Jack Parsons' lab. And but he was also engaged in incredibly hardcore occult rituals, like in 1947, and he was doing these rituals under Crowley's behest. And what's fascinating is it's the same year that all the wave of UFO sightings, and some people have said, well, there's something related there. There's some kind of a portal that got opened. who knows? But what we do know for sure is that Parsons had a very unusual death. He was an incredibly gifted rocket scientist. We never would have went to the moon without his rocketry, and he was deep, deep into Crowley's, for want of a better term, straight up black magic work. So
Well,
yeah,
sex magic.
sex.
Um,
Yeah,
Let's put it where it is. Okay.
I think it's a little deeper than that, but yes.
Okay. So the UK Today wants to know any connection between Hughes and Tesla.
Well, I think what happened with Hughes was he really got locked in to the military and then the CIA. So I think that people who were like outliers, like Tesla and people like that, after a while couldn't get to Hughes. He was surrounded by this kind of impenetrable wall, and he also had a bit of a reputation as being a wildcat. And you have to remember that this first wave of his life he spent as a movie director. So by the time he gets around to like developing airlines and all the rest of it, so there's not like a great trace history of him with some of these more innovative figures. But Hughes has to be looked at as bigger than the legend, I think. I think there's a lot of activities that he engaged in. And it is sad because he's so controlled by the CIA at the end that they can control the nature of his demise. They can say when it happened. Since nobody saw him in public, it's easy to do. And they control that incredible machinery of his wealth, basically from the late 50s on. So I do feel that when we're looking at Hughes, there's a much deeper history. And when we get Hughes in the Hotzone, I think that we're looking at part of that history. That what he was doing there, some of his projects were engaged in this idea. He wanted to get there first. He wanted to be a part of this big story. And he wanted to save America. He was just quite an enterprising figure. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so channeling the heart, Barbara Joyce says,
Yes.
Elon Musk feels like Hughes. Does Musk fit in the big picture here? As Casey said, soul groups are incarnating now as Atlantis rises.
True. I have a strange thing to say there, which is I don't think Musk is as smart as Hughes was. I think that
I think people are starting to realize that. He's kind of overblown.
I think he's placed in a very interesting position. One of the things I mentioned about that von Braun space station that they're putting up is that SpaceX is the one handling it. And of course, it has all the X Steganography on it. There's no doubt that he is a figure who came out of Silicon Valley and was really promoted into this position. And they thought he could be easily controlled. And then it turned out that he was more of a loose cannon. However, now he seems to have gotten back into the good graces a little bit. So we're seeing a little more with Musk. Musk is a very important figure, but I wouldn't put him on the level of Howard Hughes. And I also feel that some of the rhetoric coming out of him now, the way he's been able to gain favor again, is that he's talking their language. That whole thing about nuking Mars and hooking himself up to a neural network for AI. He used to be against all this stuff. So the only way he can clear himself is to come on my show and really say what the real thing is. So if he wants to do that, we'll have him on. Yes, Miss Olivia.
BH says, at age 11, Hughes built Houston's first wireless radio transmitter. He had great engineering aptitude. He was 42 when Tesla died. I wouldn't be surprised if he met or knew Tesla. Your thoughts, DJ?
I think that's very interesting. I haven't run across it. I certainly have looked for it, but I think that we can do a deeper scan. I think the later Howard Hughes, like I said, is a movie director, and that he gets into, filming like the greatest air shows and all the rest of it. So it's a little different from what Tesla's up to. So I don't know if there's a real trail there, but I think for our next episode on Hughes, we'll definitely try to see conclusively what the deal is.
Okay. TW Hitton 828. Question, has Howard Hughes' genealogy been done? Is he a royal bloodline?
Well, this is very interesting because although we associate him with, being from Texas and very kind of like down to earth type guy, his dad was part of the Harvard Club. So, it is there's no doubt the connections that the father had really inspired this life. If you go further back in further generations, I do feel that with the mother also, there's also a very big elite bloodline factor with Hughes. So I don't, yeah, the kind of rags to riches guy and like down home Texas guy who just has all this money and acts like a wild card, I don't think it's true. And the amazing thing is that I do feel that being from Texas, though, he got great interactive skills, that he could work with people because he had this kind of background of working with community in Texas. But it is fascinating when you get into it that way. It would be good to go do very detailed genealogy on Hughes. Yes.
Okay, Esoteric 369 Wall. Is there a connection with the massive oil spill explosion in the Gulf and the Hotzone mystery?
Yeah, it's interesting. That massive spill that they had, they thought about making these reparations to Bimini and Andros and other places because they were going to be, kind of collateral damage for that. And supposedly it turned out to be not as bad. But certainly that whole thing was a complete disaster, and I think anything that was around the Gulf at that time certainly took the brunt of it. There's an interesting thing in oceanography and something that the Casey readings say when he's talking about Bimini. He's saying around Bimini that water clears itself in 20 feet. So I don't know if that has something to do with the current. One of the things I didn't bring into this episode, but which was fascinating, is that it was Benjamin Franklin who developed, who discovered the Gulf Stream. And he did all these detailed maps in the Hotzone and figured out that with the Gulf Stream, if you rode the Gulf Stream, you could get anywhere in a very short period of time. And I found his exposure to the Gulf Stream and his map making around this part of the other esoteric piece about what the Hotzone is all about. That there again, it's Casey in his reading saying if you study the Gulf Stream, you will find out basically, you're going to run into this culture of Atlantis. That's where the study of it can be had. So yeah, quite remarkable. Yes.
Okay, so this is from a little bit before. Silver Fox wanted to know, was Howard Hughes drugged MK style?
No question, yes, absolutely. And what happened was in the 40s, he was testing out a lot of different planes, and he was under a lot of pressure. And like I said, he'd had congressional hearings on him, and those things, they were really enemies trying to rattle him. And other people taking shots, just because when you're a public figure, they can do that. But he had some projects that were into some overruns, and what he did was he was getting desperate to try out some of the stuff, so he flew over Los Angeles, this experimental craft, and he crashed into somebody's house. And when he came out of that, he'd had some issues, some major issues as a result of that plane crash, and I think that they exploited some tendencies that he had, and that's where a lot of this talk about the germophobia and all these OCD type qualities come about, because you don't really hear so much about those until after this accident. I think that as a result of that accident, he got hooked on certain types of drugs, and I think that by the time he gets into the 50s, there's a lot of strange stories from, these. One of them is from his wife, which she almost immediately after they got married, she didn't see him for 6 years. But she talked a lot about his very unusual, shifting, changing persona, and it feels to me that he was being influenced because of the size. He wasn't aware of the fact that his massive empire there, it would be such a trophy for the CIA to be able to use that to launder black money, and I think that's exactly what they did. That's where you get the rumors about Hughes being involved with the JFK and RFK assassination, because of his connection with Robert Mayhew, who ran his empire even though he never met him. Amazing.
Fascinating.
And Mayhew's all CIA.
Brandon Jimenez wants to know,
Yes.
is Hughes the reason Watergate happened for donating to both presidential candidates?
He did, and I do feel that they were spooked by to go into Watergate, and I think this was part of taking down Nixon, because Nixon, although the CIA was easy with him earlier, they realized a couple of things. One, Nixon was in charge of CIA Project Blue Book when he was VP. Eisenhower put him in charge of that. We got the phony public Project Blue Book, and they got the real one, CIA Blue Book. So, in fact, when you look at that situation, the CIA knew that he knew. Then, when we combine the testimony of people like Robert Merritt that we brought forward on this program and the Nixon time capsule issues, that I think Nixon was looked at as a threat by the Central Intelligence Agency. The Rockefellers saw him as someone who was opposed to that early version, the 70s version of GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which they rifled through under the Clinton era, and they just threw all these farmers off their land and forced them into the cities and took over their stuff, and Monsanto moved in. That's what the Rockefellers were looking to do. Nixon, as crafty as a character as he was, he did not think that GATT was a good idea, and he didn't want to sell out the manufacturing base of America. And they looked at him and they said, you know what, he's got so many aspects of his personality we can exploit. Let's get him out of there. And I think that they used the scare of the fact that he had worked with Hughes in this dark project to try to assassinate Castro, and that the potential that had been used in some ways to exploit the Kennedy assassination. And you can see that Nixon blackmails LBJ and the CIA with the idea that, you know, we know that you killed Kennedy, so if you don't want that to come out, if you crucify me, you're going to get that. And what they do as a compromise is they put out Gerald Ford, who because Spiro Agnew was actually, he would have been president, but they came up with some charge, put him in prison, and then Gerald Ford became Nixon's VP, and then they could install him as president without even having to be elected. But Gerald Ford, remember, his big claim to fame was that he was on the Warren Commission, and so he was in with that team. And so this was the agreement. That's how Nixon got pardoned, which he basically was like, you know, you're Richard Helms, the CIA director. If you implicate, you know, if you let me go down and go to prison for Watergate, then you guys are getting sent up the river for the JFK assassination. It's quite interesting when you look at it that way. What I think is fascinating in the Village Voice article, I won't read it all here, it's very long, but it's quite remarkable. Watergate, the Bahamas, and Howard Hughes. I would recommend it. I think it gives us some of that background. It also talks about Howard Hughes' land development scheme in the Bahamas. And I think that when you get Howard Hughes in the Hotzone, we're getting very close to the truth there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's fantastic to have everyone here. It's a great crowd tonight. Of course, we're all excited to have Miss Olivia back in the driver's seat.
And it is so good to be back.
Doing more amazing than ever. And we're taking your questions here. We're going to take a few more questions. And also I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, get that going back and forth with us. It's a free newsletter. It's going to give you great updates about exciting, important shows we have coming up. And let me tell you, for the fall, you've never seen anything like the fall that we have planned for you here at Dark Journalist. While you're there, subscribe to the site. We've made it incredibly affordable for you to do exactly that. And what we want you to do is get behind the show. And you know, it is that crucial kind of period in time, which is you want to be able to get behind the things that are giving you the good information, or looking for the real answers. So often, I think in the independent media, there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of people trying to sell you your own emotions back to you. And in the mainstream media, they're just trying to make you forget about anything important. So you got to find those avenues, and we try to bring forward that kind of research for you here on this program. So go ahead and subscribe, get behind the work that we're doing, and some of the incredible people that we're going to help bring forward to you in the fall. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Blazing River wants to know, any Kubrick ties?
Well, that's interesting. No, see, the thing is that Hughes had gotten out of circulation and really had become behind this apparatus. I think what you find more than anything else is he had interesting obsessions. Like he didn't like the fact that they were doing nuclear testing in Nevada, and he felt when he was building these things there that the nuclear testing was going to, so he had a great sense for these things. He was associated with Area 51. He's certainly so deeply rooted and so deeply associated with a number of Hollywood people and starlets. But by the time you get him into the 60s, he's in this kind of MK Ultra psychotic state where they can just use him for different things. And by the time they actually take him out and install a double, God knows what the process is there, but it does seem like it has something to do with the time where he goes to live in the Hotzone and when he's there at Xanadu, which I think is the X Steganography. You have to remember, Hughes was deep in the X Steganography. He had the XF-11. The Hughes XF-11 was a prototype military reconnaissance aircraft designed and flown by Hughes and built by Hughes Aircraft. During the first XF-11 flight in 1946, Howard Hughes crashed the aircraft into Beverly Hills, California. So that accident I was talking about was when he was rushing this thing out, the XF-11. I think what we can find with Hughes that's fascinating is he's deep. That's really the core engine of the secret space program comes out of Hughes Aircraft, and that's a really crucial point because Hughes Aerospace eventually would get absorbed. The Hughes Medical is still out there, but there's no question in my mind that so many of the things that he was developing in Hughes Aerospace became part of that secret space program. This book, which is actually by John Meyer, it's by Gerald Bellett, but it's John Meyer's story, Age of Secrets, contains so much interesting information about Robert Mayhew. And John Meyer was Hughes' bookkeeper for 2 decades, and he knew exactly how the operation ran, and he was one of the few people that Hughes interfaced with directly. I recommend this book, Age of Secrets, in relation to this. It's quite powerful. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, well, we're getting a lot of questions just sort of about Space Force and whatnot. So we're going to have to do an episode on that because so much is happening.
No question.
But
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I want to mention this. There was a big to-do about Space Command, that Trump did Space Command. That's not Space Force. And I want to really point that out. And
so what's Space Command?
Well, Space Command, we already have it. All he did was re-inaugurate it.
Okay.
So
why would he do that? Why would he go through the pomp and circumstance of doing that?
It's interesting because what happens is this: you need a triumph, right? You're trying to get the Space Force. Now, he announced the Space Force with no infrastructure because you need Congress, you need the Senate to develop a program if you're going to develop an actual wing of the armed forces. That's what the Space Force is. Space Command has been there. George H.W. Bush had Space Command, but Dan Quayle was in charge of it the same way Mike Pence is. So these are not, that is just, hey, we're re-inaugurating this thing that got mothballed. So it's kind of a phony triumph on the part of Trump. Now, I think Trump does a lot of posturing to get control back over that UFO file, and I think we've seen the really kind of lame version of, with GTSA, of the Clintons trying to maintain this power over the UFO file. And they're both trying to get their hands in there. I think with the Trump thing, the only real warning, I like the fact because Trump has the connection of his uncle. We've done the program Tesla Trump and the Time Capsule, which I highly recommend as an X series episode. And it is, in fact, the most viewed episode that we have of the X series. But it spells it out, basically, that Trump's uncle was the protege of Vannevar Bush, who Robert Sarbarker, the physicist, as we mentioned earlier, said was in charge of the UFO file. Therefore, John Trump, being part of the Rad Lab and under Vannevar Bush, if Vannevar Bush had him as his best scientist and he was at head of the UFO file, guess who worked on the UFO file, and guess who was close to his nephew, Donald? John Trump, who, by the way, only lived about 15 minutes from us here in Cambridge before he passed away. But it's interesting because what I would say in relation to that is the dangerous part about what Trump is talking about with it is that he's saying we have to make space a war-fighting domain. That's a big no-no. This is what Kennedy, Reagan, they try to prevent that. And with Reagan, there was Star Wars, they used it. But with Kennedy, and specifically, he wanted to make sure that when we got into space, all countries could agree that warfare ended at the water's edge here on Earth and did not take that into space, which is why he wanted to do a joint moon mission instead of a space race with the Russians. So we can't go into this pose. That's part of, that's a dangerous step for the president. And they might have said, hey, that's an easy way to get your Space Force inaugurated. But if you make space a warfighting domain, then you're condemning the human race to, endless war. And you have to do it better. You should make space a peace domain, therefore develop all this, stuff for it. They've privatized so much of what we've spent. I mean, all that money we drove into NASA and all the rest of it, we haven't even been to the moon since 1972. Where did all the money go? So if you ask Catherine Austin Fitts, this $21 trillion hanging out from the Pentagon and HUD, never mind all these other agencies. So there's a lot of money there that needs to be accounted for. Yes.
Okay, there are two really great things I want to bring up here.
Okay.
So, Kontiki Man wanted to know your thoughts on this private entity putting a time capsule with tardigrades on the moon. I don't know about this.
You know what? I want you to send me the details for it to info@darkjournalist.com.
Okay.
And since you're interested in that, look into the time capsule that they put up there with CDs in the late 60s under President Nixon.
What? CDs?
CDs. I know.
I did not know that.
Very interesting indeed.
Okay.
Yes.
The other thing is, this is crazy. Google Collusion says DARPA tweeted about how they're looking for underground locations for, quote, mass populating on a short notice. They showed pictures of subways, for example. There were multiple tweets around this, and I want everybody to know about it so we can follow up on it together.
Okay. Well.
That's a little disturbing.
It is. I mean, Google is basically a Central Intelligence Agency outfit. That's how they were developed. And they may have grown beyond the mandate, but they had to be deep with the CIA to get launched on the level that they are. And again, I think, they have a great product. The problem is they are, like a lot of the corporations and part of the Davos crowd, they are overexpanding into a global control grid, a technocracy, a corporate dictatorship, and that's not the way that we want to go. We want the corporations to really play by the rules, and they just have too much power right now, especially over the political process, and it doesn't get any better. One thing I want to read real quickly, I'm mentioning books. This is a very important book. Charles Higham wrote Howard Hughes' The Secret Life. Now, Charles Higham wrote Trading with the Enemy, which is one of the best books about how the American business interests promoted the Nazi companies and corporations and how they got a real foothold over here. And, the Bushes are a big part of that. But one of the things I think is important in his work, by the way, what's weird is that in Wikipedia, if you look at that book list, they don't list Trading with the Enemy among his books. And it's like his best book, but it's all about, it does out a lot of people. So I was like, wow, that's interesting censorship. But anyway, the book is out there, and there's a great little piece that he has in here about the Glomar. I'm going to read it real quick. Quote, actually, the Glomar's purpose was to make soundings on the site of an exploded Russian nuclear submarine, fresh from Cuban waters, which would be raised to the surface by another far larger Glomar Explorer to be built by Hughes. The Explorer would be the length of 2 football fields and would be equipped with a giant claw, which in one fell swoop would pick up the submarine, house it in a vast cargo hold, and ship it back to San Diego for inspection. Look at this. Now take that whole process and think about the incredible ruins that we're talking about. A giant claw, which in one fell swoop would pick up the submarine, supposedly like a Russian submarine, and house it on there. Just take that process and think of archaeology. So they find things down there, they need to have a way to bring them up. You would develop a gigantic claw to do that. The cost of the venture would be $250 million of government money. But why just bring up a submarine? According to former CIA operative and author Victor Marchetti, the reason for the salvage operation was to obtain cipher machines which were believed to be aboard submarines. These machines and the accompanying documents would tell the CIA how to interpret, translate previously intercepted messages, for which a vast boxcar stockpile existed in the intelligence room at Fort Meade, Maryland. Through understanding what the messages contained, it would be possible to track and intercept Russian nuclear subs off Cuba, and to determine how Castro was served by Soviet nuclear power. Hughes was delighted to cooperate in this venture. Again, his motive was carrying out the policies of the intelligence schemes of the Nixon government. He would see hundreds of millions pouring into Hughes aircraft, all of it tax-sheltered inside Hughes Medical Institute. Now, what's interesting about this is the setup reason that they have is, hey, you're going to be able to track these subs. So the cover story is so well built there and well defined. But one of the beautiful things that Higgin does in this book is he points out that the Glomar's whole purpose was not this weird thing that they said, oh, there's a sub up there in Hawaii. It's Cuba. This is the great breakthrough in that book. Everything that the Glomar was set up to do all happened in the Hotzone. So we think past the cover story and we think, you have this massive ship, you have this incredible claw, you have the ability to store items aboard this thing. It's completely sanctioned as like a black project by the U.S. government. What could be more perfect? And I'm sure that they were like, how can we get our hands on stuff that's right off the coast of Cuba? Yes. Okay, back to you, Miss Olivia.
Okay. CRCR1.
Oh, yes.
Oceanography-wise, any insights about the Amelia Earhart search that was just done by the Titanic team? Titanic search was a cover for looking for Russian submarines. Any Casey Earhart link?
Yes. Oh, wow. There's so much there. Well, an interesting thing is Amelia Earhart lived in Medford, which is one city over. And she had a very, very fascinating setup there. And what happened was people had come to Casey for readings about Earhart and her disappearance. And he tracked her very closely, the entire thing. And in fact, what he said is that it's very touching reading, actually, when he talks about when she dies. But in essence, he said that she died of exposure when the plane went down. There are so many interesting stories about the Japanese taking this woman captive and all the rest of it. And Amelia Earhart's story has so many strange and interesting turns to it. But Casey certainly did readings on the disappearance of Earhart, no question about it. And they are eerie. They are very eerie. I highly recommend them. Yes.
B. Pinkerton. Ask Daniel if he observed the Atlantis steganography on Epstein's New Mexico ranch, Epstein Caribbean Island, Maxwell's mini sub and Ocean Foundation, Epstein's Mexico ranch giant Atlantean symbol, 5 question marks.
I'll tell you that when all of that came up, I collected a number of things about Epstein, and I didn't want to exploit the situation basically by just coming out with an Epstein episode around the stuff, but there's no question that there's some very, very unusual occult artifacts and esoteric links around the Epstein aspect. And I will tell you that from my conversations with Professor Peter Dale Scott, the kind of sexual deep politics that Epstein was engaged in have a long, long history, and some of the work and the questions that Professor Scott is raising, and Professor Scott's amazing. Here he is, 90 years old. He does better work than anyone. But he's raising the right questions, which is, how does Epstein relate to the larger power structure? It's not really important if we get in. I mean, it's important to know the details, but the kind of salacious side of all these things that he did. Who is he connected to? Who does he represent? Who are the people responsible for bumping him off? It's so ridiculous that apparently the cameras didn't work and the guards weren't. It's all absurd. This reminds me of when Oswald was killed while in police custody, and
They still don't know how Ruby got into the underground parking.
No. I mean,
Right. Nobody's admitted
you'd
to
have to have someone on the police force let you in. What's interesting about all that also is that it's like a pattern, and anyone who understands security and all the rest of it and how important Epstein was, they took a tremendous chance doing this, because even average people questioned that. And they
My
took
dad, he knew instantly.
and he wouldn't be the kind of
He
guy who
is
would jump on
not the
board.
kind of guy who thinks in those terms at all.
Fantastic.
It's red pilled a lot of people. I hate to use that term, but it's
I
really true.
absolutely 100% agree. Okay, fantastic questions tonight. Everybody is on their very best. We're going to take two more questions and wrap it up. You're watching the Dark Journalist program. It is great to be here with everyone. Fantastic questions. And we're just getting into the Hot Zone. There's so many Hot Zone episodes that we're going to be working on, and some very important guests coming forward to speak about things that have been completely left off in relation to the Hot Zone. It's going to blow your mind. So for the next 2 months, look for it here with the shows that we're doing. The Hot Zone represents, like X Steganography, it's all related. It represents a move towards understanding, and it brings in the mystery schools, it brings in the esoteric understanding, and then it brings in the deep state aspects and how they all interrelate in this geopolitical situation going on there. But what is particularly important is there's a trail from people who understand the whole Atlantis rising aspect, that there's land rising, that's a political situation, that there are ruins related to the land rising. That gives us a whole different culture that was here before, the Sumerians in 6000 BC, where we count civilization from. That's not going to fly anymore. So what do? That's a hot potato. So the Hot Zone and the things that we've discovered about it is truly expensive. And if we understand the Hemingway aspect, what he was doing there, what was going on in relation to archaeology around these areas, what was going on in relation to Casey and the mystery schools revealing that Poseidia was raising up, that the temple was raising off the coast of Bimini. These are important questions, and this is really, we find these incredible figures like Hughes in the middle of it. We do have a show about Onassis coming up, and mentioning Jacqueline Onassis tonight, we just showed this amazing link with her in Bimini, and she's not up to anything sinister, don't get me wrong, but in these fields, in these circles, they are aware of these things, and that's what I'm trying to get us on the same page, for sure. And I'm sure things like Epstein Island and people just purchasing these islands. Look, Howard Hughes purchased, or he leased, Quesal in the Bahamas. So quite remarkable, the types, the incredible funds that these people can bring to bear. And, you look at that and you think, oh, here's like the Cayman Islands, here's these other things. Like, it's all related to incredible business and the kind of things that they're able to do, because it is offshore, and there's so much offshoring of these things. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I want to actually throw this out to you. So Grandma Tipito says one theory for the Epstein death is that he was no longer needed for money laundering. People get to a point where they're a liability.
Oh, yeah.
There's too much light on them.
Yes.
And they have to be eliminated, even if it sort of shows that mechanism, you know, even if people don't believe the suicide, it was too risky to have him be alive and make a deal, right? So could you talk about that a little bit?
Wow, fascinating. I think you just summed it up better than anyone. It's true though, because what are you going to do with a guy like that? At any point, how can any of those people sleep at night knowing that this guy was in custody?
No, they're terrified.
Yes.
I think they're still frightened.
And so was he, but you know, who won, right? So, you know, now all those trips with Dershowitz and Clinton and whoever else, how are we going to find out about it? There's going to be cases, things will come out, but the whole picture, now they dropped the case officially in court today. And that's important because all the discovery and all the motions around the case that all dries up. Other things can happen against his estate or whatever, but that was really a key thing, having a living, breathing, a perpetrator who was this interconnectivity point to all these deep state players, you know, and we've had people like that before. But I think in this case, you know, having him in custody and ready to face trial along those lines, you know, as being basically the pimp to all these different people in these high-end positions and operating all those kind of deep state activities, he was too much. But what's fascinating is killing him is too much also. So this was an overreach. This is definitely a deep event. And I think that kind of overreach is waking up a lot of people. It may not have the intended consequences. They might be like, we'll have to take the risk and hope people will forget. Yes.
I wonder if you can relate that to Howard Hughes and how they handled him, because they didn't kill him, but they kept him a prisoner, kept him drugged.
They needed his resources, they needed his name, they needed his estate, they needed his empire. Yeah, I think that they co-opted him, whereas I think what's interesting about Epstein is he was just kind of a flunky, that they were like, this guy, you know, we can use him for a lot of different things.
I know, he seems very unimpressive, right?
He's incredibly unimpressive. Even his business training and his academic background are zilch. I mean, it was pretty bad scene. So he was definitely positioned, and that positioning comes out of the very corrupt core of the New York political underbelly. There's no question about it. Wow. Okay, we'll take one more question, and
Okay.
yeah, I want to say something in relation to the Atlantis part, which is somebody asked a question about Carmen Bolter, and she is going to be coming back on the show. She's an outstanding researcher. We've done great shows with her in the past, and Carmen is one of my very favorite guests of all time. She's in Spain now, and so it's a little harder for us to hook up. However, we're going to do it, and her Atlantis documentary series, her original series about the pyramids went to Netflix. We know all that. She's working on a new one in relation to Atlantis, and we're all very, very excited to see that. I have not spoken to her specifically about the Hotzone work, but the Hotzone work that is kind of like autonomous in a sense. It draws from all the different things. But I would say there are great discoveries to be had all across the world. Some people, you know, it's funny, they will say, well, Atlantis was in Antarctica or Atlantis was in the Sahara, whatever. There are powerful cultures that were impacted by Atlantis, and they spread out all over the globe. So all of these different things, from the Tartaria to the Sahara and to the Antarctica, there's great mysteries in all of them because they represent the great history that we have in ancient times. The thing about Atlantis is it's spoken of in a specific way by the people who put it on the map. Plato, who put it in the Atlantic beyond the Straits of Heracles, which is the Rock of Gibraltar and the Straits of Gibraltar. So that puts it over there, and he calls, you know, I've spoken with Graham Hancock about this extensively. He's literally referring to the continent beyond that. So either he's talking about America or he's talking about land that sank. The great work of the mystery schools have told us that Atlantis was in the Atlantic, which is where the name derives its meaning, and that specifically in the Casey work, which I feel is the best source for Atlantis cognitive information about Atlantis is that the height, that it spanned the entire Atlantic. It's split into three islands, Arion, Og, and Poseidia. And that Poseidia was the most powerful, and it was where the children of the Emilius, who were against the sons of Belial, had their headquarters. That's where Bimini is. That's where the Hotzone is. That's why I think it's such a hot potato. It literally is the last real height of civilization that sank. But certainly all of these areas have secrets to be divulged. Antarctica, of course, there's incredible information. Look at the Pura Reis map where it's not covered in ice. I mean, that's amazing. The Sahara discoveries are important. They are, and they're related. You know, if you look in the Casey readings, he talks about a group of Atlanteans who go to the Sahara when it was in a totally different climate, because we know all those climates changed about 12,000 years ago. So even Egypt had rains, right? That's how Robert Schoch found out that the Sphinx had weather watering on it from rain, and they hadn't had rain since 10,000 BC. So if the Sphinx has weather watering, it makes sense that the Sphinx was built in 10,000 BC. These are just the logical things that normal science would assume, but instead they've been blocked because archaeology has a story and they want to stick to their story. It's really quite remarkable if you think about it. But anyway, not here. We're taking a totally different approach here. Miss Olivia, you get the last question of the night.
Okay, so Michael Shaw wants to know, today, who would you consider to be the major players associated with the Hotzone?
Oh, it's an excellent question. I think that Richard Branson is deeply involved in activities in the Hotzone, and I think that we're seeing that definitely, you know, Cuba, they're trying to starve Cuba out, and I think it's heavily related to what's off the coast there, and the incredible work that Polina Zalitsky did in finding those cities. So you've got a whole city off the coast of the western tip of Cuba, and if you're other countries, how do you get at it? This becomes the question. Russia is certainly a major player with their bellicose language, saying, well, it's a new Cuban Missile Crisis, and really letting the tone of the Cold War creep in. I don't like the things that we were doing with Russia, the posturing we were doing against Russia. But then they're coming back now with their own kind of bad behaviors as well. And I think that we're looking at a situation where they're very, very knowledgeable about hot zone activity, and they want the rising land and they want the ruins associated with Atlantis as well. So I do feel that American corporate interests versus Russia and Cuba and even Venezuela to a certain degree, which is why so many of the Russian reinforcements arrived there. All of that is related to the hot zone activity. Every once in a while, you see a major figure like McAfee, for example, when he went to the hot zone. Boy, they got him out of there really quick, you know. When he was saying, hey, I'm going to run my entire presidential campaign from Cuba. They don't want this guy down there. You know, it's those types of kind of independent operators, bull in a china shop, that can really mess things up for them. Even the presence of the hot zone information that we've put out on this program is a problem. And I think with X Steganography, we see them flaunting X Steganography a lot more, and either we predicted it was happening or they tuned into the program and knew the stuff was coming out and wanted to get a handle on it. So this is how information works. And that's just it with revelations, you know, and the kind of work that we do. Not to say that they're paying all this attention to us, but the fact is when you get the information out there, they need to do something to guide it. And I think we see a lot more in relation to that. So it is very fascinating. I think you're going to see a lot more activity. Look for activity related in the hot zone to the Bahamas, to Yucatan, and all these things. They may even start a cycle of kind of, just like with the UFO file and TTSA, a kind of false disclosure thing. We might even start to see that. Amazing. Wow, incredible. What an amazing show. And there's so much more to do with Hughes. And we will, rest assured. But he is an amazing figure, and I'm glad that we got the time in with everyone tonight for this episode. We will see you next week on Friday, and we hope you have a fantastic Labor Day weekend. And I guess the only question left, Miss Olivia, is...
Well, before we get to that, I want to give a shout out, a great thanks
Yes.
to Big Papa Pump,
Yes.
who gave a nice big donation tonight.
Oh,
Just because
fantastic.
you give me sanity in an insane world. Isn't that nice? Eric Vosseler, Les Chat, Slow Time, B. Brax, and Jessa Lynn. So thank you so much for your generous contributions.
Fantastic. You know, and getting behind the program makes a
Yes.
huge difference. So thank you very much.
I do want to say that there are some things we'd like to do, some shows we'd like to do, but
Oh,
they
yeah.
would require a little extra funding. So if anybody has been on the fence, we have some interesting projects. I don't want to tip my hand, but it would require a little more capital.
No
to make it
question.
happen.
No question. Oh, it's a great time to get behind the program
Mhm.
because of the things that we're working on. And I like what you said, though, which is that procrastination is not, this is not the time for procrastination. This is literally right before 2020 when they have the election swing in. They're going to ride everyone through this incredible crucible of the election. And this is really still the build-up time that we can get our hands on some of this information before that all that confusion rips in or they throw everyone off social media or whatever. So yeah, definitely get behind the show. Go to darkjournalist.com, subscribe, contribute, and get behind the work that we're doing here. And we definitely appreciate that. Make sure you get on the mailing list, sign up at darkjournalist.com, and get behind all the great people that we have here on the show too, the work that's available right now. It's a very special time. You know, we have people like Catherine Austin Fitz, Joseph Farrell, and you know, the work that we do with Gigi Young, outstanding. You know, I see Gigi out there. It's great to see you. And you know, we have people, we have the resources, we have the stuff now. Let's make things happen. Now it's the best. It's the best time. And we're bringing more and more of those people forward all the time. We had a great two-part series with Alana Freeland, and all of her work around 5G and the space fence. I mean, this stuff is off the charts.
Mhm.
I can't even believe the amount of incredible information that's available right now. And we're trying to bring it to you here through the Dark Journalist show and with the work that we're doing. And for me, as far as it goes, I can tell you this, the X Steganography forms the kind of outline, but the hot zone is really where we can see it in action and turning over. So the hot zone, Atlantis Rising, and Land Rising there with the ruins connected to the Mystery School predictions in relation to that is absolutely explosive. So if we can get our hands on that, amazing, you know, and like I said, we'll back off the CIA on TTSA and, you know, send them packing on the UFO file. They're not going to get their hands on that. These are very important things. I know that we've seen a lot of different disclosure cults come in and try to use esoteric language and things like that. You know, push back and really putting up boundaries against that kind of stuff is the greatest thing you can do, because all they do is harvest the public round and round in circles until it's too late to do anything. So it's very important that we seize this opportunity that was predicted for us by the mystery schools, by characters like Helena Blavatsky and Casey and Rudolf Steiner, who told us this was the window where we'd have the opportunity here 100 years later after World War One. So here we are. We have the opportunity. So we definitely appreciate it. I'll shout out to a few people. Modwiz is out there.
Yes, indeed.
Great stuff. Always good to see Modwiz. And I have two screens with names. So this is good. One eye's looking at one set and one eye's
Scarlet
looking-
Fire says, I want my country back. I'm with you.
I like that.
I want my country
See?
back too.
Now you're talking. Scarlet Fire, we're right there with you. Amy Chen, it's great to have you out there. Scruples, always a
Mhm.
blast. And I think Scruples is actually in the Netherlands. What time is it, Scruples, in the Netherlands? It's got to be like 5 o'clock in the morning. That's my kind of a viewer. We will see you all next week, and thank you so much to everyone. And of course, I mentioned Groovy, and I mentioned, hey, Lee Veltman's out there. Kate, fantastic. Thank you so much. we will see you all.
Denmark. Scribbles in Denmark.
Oh, that's where he is. Well, what time is it? Jonathan Fries, it's great to see you. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Najat, excellent. Thank you. Of course, join us on Twitter also at Dark Journalist. There's a lot of great conversations there. And make sure that you tune in next Friday. We'll be here at 8 p.m. And Olivia, great to have you back. My God, it's
Thank
almost
you.
like you make everything run so smoothly. I don't even recognize the show.
And now I don't feel rusty anymore. I think I got my groove back.
You're back in it. You're like a boxer who's like, you're ready for the first round TKO. We will see you all next week. And thank you very much, everyone. Have a great Labor Day weekend. And remember to take some time off, for heaven's sake.
Enjoy what's left of the summer.
And for everyone in the hot zone who's facing up against Hurricane Dorian, good luck, batten down the hatches. And in Florida, make sure you stock up lots of water and look out, check in on your neighbors and check in on any elderly people that are out there. So take this special time to do it. They might be in need. And we will see you all in the hot zone next week.
Okay. Good night, everybody. God bless.
Hey, what's for dinner, by the way?
Onion rings. But that's a kitchen.
That's kind of a good, but is that symbolic?
Of what? The hot zone?
Well, we started with Tom Garden. I'm trying to okay.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We have to work on that.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you from Tom Garden. Yes. Hey, look, it says the broadcast is over, but it's not. I know it's not. Never.
Is it still not over?